technology, engineering, and mathematics education. In 2019, the I-10 launched the first STEM Teacher Fellowship of the Americas. The Energy and Climate Partnership of the Americas, ECPA, is working with governments in the Caribbean to advance electric mobility and clean transport as the sub-region pursues energy independence. Under our Integrated Water Resources Management Program, SETI is responding to the demand of member states for platforms and applications that enable data-driven policies. In the Central American region, for example, we are expanding the scope of Costa Rica's Plataforma Interactiva de Aplicación del Clima Tropical. This tool captures and disseminates real-time climate and water data, promoting resilient agriculture. The Inter-American Committee on Ports is building human and institutional capacity through public-private partnerships to address port modernization, logistics, and security. CooperaNet, SETI's multi-stakeholder platform for cooperation and partnerships, is being relaunched in 2019, responding to member states' call for a more robust hub for cooperation. In a region where 8 out of 10 consumers begin or end their shopping process online, SETI has entered into a partnership with the private sector.
Es una herramienta que sin duda acerca a las MIPYMES hacia la demanda que hoy está migrando a Internet, y con eso pretendemos mejorar las ventas y el posicionamiento de las empresas pequeñas.
As we look to the future, the Executive Secretariat for Integral Development will continue to leverage cooperation and partnerships to expand our reach, proving that together we are much more than the sum of our 34 member states.
Me and my kids have been there for over an year right now. And children are friends. It doesn't matter where they come from.
Nosotros estamos en una zona netamente selvática. La línea de adyacencia va desde el norte hasta el sur, va desde Modesto Méndez hasta Aguas Turbias, tanto en el norte como en el sur. Esta línea tiene 215 kilómetros de extensión.
De allí vino él, se buscó creo con los de la OEA y de allí vino el proyecto para acá, para Judá. Y fue que lo dieron el terreno y lo dieron todo que era mano de obra y el material para hacer de las casas que están ahorita. Y por ese motivo estamos aquí viviendo todavía.
La misión continúa trabajando en la implementación de medidas de fomento de la confianza mientras se aguarda el resultado del reclamo que está atendiendo la Corte Internacional de Justicia por la disputa marítima, territorial e insular. Nuestra oficina en la zona de adyacencia realiza verificaciones a solicitud de ambos gobiernos, facilita reuniones y patrullajes conjuntos entre las Fuerzas Armadas y promueve una cultura de paz y cooperación entre las comunidades locales.
Children will be children and they have harmony. They don't see each other as a different country, but they see each other that they're growing together.
Hoy, esta organización es el guardián regional en defensa de la democracia, la libertad y los derechos humanos. Los países se han comprometido con estos valores a través de instrumentos legales como la Carta Democrática Interamericana, la Convención Americana de Derechos Humanos y todas las demás convenciones interamericanas. Nuestro trabajo es mantener los más altos estándares. Debemos ser objetivos, analizar los hechos, denunciar cuando veamos corrupción, inequidad o amenazas a la libertad. En esos casos no podemos ser neutrales.
more than 100 years since the inauguration of this building, the OAS headquarters, our institution still brings together the peoples of the Americas to address our responsibilities as a partnership of nations. As we look to the future, our work must also focus on the construction of a positive agenda that continues to favorably impact millions of lives every day.
SETI's results for 2018 proves our effectiveness as a development partner, placing people at the center of our work and leveraging partnerships and cooperation to transform policy imperatives into action. With an eye on the rapidly changing global context, SETI is innovating to constructively address the emerging challenges and opportunities for the region. As part of our competitiveness program, SETI is designing precise tools to assess assets and capabilities in the productive sector to determine paths towards higher value goods and services. As our flagship program for partnerships, the Americas Competitiveness Exchange on Innovation and Entrepreneurship, the OAS, will continue to leverage good practices and the power of networks to increase trade and investment in the region.
For us, the role of the OAS is very important, connecting countries, connecting governments and private sector, and letting us know what other countries are doing it and how we can replicate that in our countries to enhance development.
For me, who has come here to look at how can we develop our own ecosystem, our own innovation hubs, our own accelerators, I think seeing this, touching, feeling, seeing the transformation, seeing how quickly you've made it happen is a testament to what is possible. So I believe all of us leave here stronger than ever.
The Working Group of Experts on Subnational Competitiveness, the GTEX, is our gateway program to promote local economic competitiveness policies alongside municipal and state-level governments, together with the private sector and academia.
Este tipo de reuniones te sirven para darte cuenta de todo lo que se está viviendo en América Latina sobre los temas de competitividad. Y hoy justamente en este sector estamos viendo sobre todo los temas de innovación tecnológica. Los que si hablamos de competitividad tenemos que hablar de tecnología. Y me está ayudando mucho para ver el panorama de ver lo que están haciendo otras ciudades y lo que podemos llegar a aplicar también nosotros en México.
The Hub on the Transfer and Commercialization of Technology is connecting and strengthening national innovation ecosystems in the region. Each edition of the Hub trains budding technology entrepreneurs from the region's public and private sectors to take promising products and services from idea to market.
Porque es importante que estemos juntos en esto, porque la región tiene que estar unida y me parece que hay mucho conocimiento en la región que todavía no está explotado comercialmente como podría hacer, y esta es la mejor manera de hacerlo.
Tenemos la proyección de cada año generar y compartir nuevas experiencias entre aquellos que contribuyen a la innovación, Queremos cambiar el cómo lo hemos estado haciendo en Latinoamérica. Queremos generar la unión de los países, queremos colaborar.
Our virtual platform on technology foresight, Prospecta Americas, will support OAS member states in identifying and mapping future trends and technological development of critical importance for the Americas.
Este esfuerzo, el cual viene siendo apoyado por la Organización de los Estados Americanos, nos permitirá tener una gran información para poder mapear estas iniciativas de innovación y poder que ellas contribuyan al crecimiento económico, a la competitividad y al bienestar de nuestras naciones.
Como bien sabemos, nos encontramos ya en la cuarta revolución industrial, la que está cambiando rápidamente la forma en que se hace negocios, se produce, se consume y se genera bienestar y entretenimiento en el mundo. Es la mayor amenaza, tal vez la mejor oportunidad que tenemos en nuestras naciones.
The Inter-American Teacher Education Network, the I-10, is working to improve the quality of teachers with an emphasis on science, technology, engineering, and mathematics education. In 2019, the I-10 launched the first STEM Teacher Fellowship of the Americas. The Energy and Climate Partnership of the Americas, ECPA, is working with governments in the Caribbean to advance electric mobility and clean transport as the sub-region pursues energy independence. Under our Integrated Water Resources Management Program, SETI is responding to the demand of member states for platforms and applications that enable data-driven policies. In the Central American region, for example, we are expanding the scope of Costa Rica's Plataforma Interactiva de Aplicación del Clima Tropical. This tool captures and disseminates real-time climate and water data, promoting resilient agriculture. The Inter-American Committee on Ports is building human and institutional capacity through public-private partnerships to address port modernization, logistics, and security. CooperaNet, SETI's multi-stakeholder platform for cooperation and partnerships, is being relaunched in 2019, responding to member states' call for a more robust hub for cooperation. In a region where 8 out of 10 consumers begin or end their shopping process online, SETI has entered into a partnership with the private sector.
Es una herramienta que sin duda acerca a las MIPYMES hacia la demanda que hoy está migrando a Internet, y con eso pretendemos mejorar las ventas y el posicionamiento de las empresas pequeñas.
As we look to the future, the Executive Secretariat for Integral Development will continue to leverage cooperation and partnerships to expand our reach, proving that together we are much more than the sum of our 34 member states.
Me and my kids have been there for over an year right now. And children are friends. It doesn't matter where they come from.
nosotros estamos en una zona netamente selvática. La línea de adyacencia va desde el norte hasta el sur, va desde Modesto Méndez hasta Aguas Turbias, tanto en el norte como en el sur. Esta línea tiene 215 kilómetros de extensión.
De allí vino él, se buscó creo con los de la OEA y de allí vino el proyecto para acá, para Judá. Y fue que lo dieron el terreno, y lo dieron todo lo que era mano de obra y el material para hacer las casas que están ahorita. Y por ese motivo estamos aquí viviendo todavía.
La misión continúa trabajando en la implementación de medidas de fomento de la confianza mientras aguarda el resultado del reclamo que está atendiendo la Corte Internacional de Justicia por la disputa marítima, territorial e insular. Nuestra oficina en la zona de adyacencia realiza verificaciones a solicitud de ambos gobiernos, facilita reuniones y patrullajes conjuntos entre las Fuerzas Armadas y promueve una cultura de paz y cooperación entre las comunidades locales.
Children will be children. And they have harmony. They don't see each other as a different country, but they see each other that they're growing together.
Con la ayuda financiera de la Unión Europea.
Hoy, esta organización es el guardián regional en defensa de la democracia, la libertad y los derechos humanos. Los países se han comprometido con estos valores a través de instrumentos legales como la Carta Democrática Interamericana, la Convención Americana de Derechos Humanos y todas las demás convenciones interamericanas. Nuestro trabajo es mantener los más altos estándares. Debemos ser objetivos, analizar los hechos, denunciar cuando veamos corrupción, inequidad o amenazas a la libertad. En esos casos no podemos ser neutrales.
than 100 years since the inauguration of this building, the OAS headquarters, our institution still brings together the peoples of the Americas to address our responsibilities as a partnership of nations. As we look to the future, our work must also focus on the construction of a positive agenda that continues to favorably impact millions of lives every day.
SETI's results for 2018 proves our effectiveness as a development partner, placing people at the center of our work and leveraging partnerships and cooperation to transform policy imperatives into action. With an eye on the rapidly changing global context, SETI is innovating to constructively address the emerging challenges and opportunities for the region. As part of our competitiveness program, SETI is designing precise tools to assess assets and capabilities in the productive sector to determine paths towards higher value goods and services. As our flagship program for partnerships, the Americas Competitiveness Exchange on Innovation and Entrepreneurship, the OAS, will continue to leverage good practices and the power of networks to increase trade and investment in the region.
For us, the role of the OAS is very important, connecting countries, connecting governments and private sector, and letting us know what other countries are doing it and how we can replicate that in our countries to enhance development.
For me, who has come here to look at how can we develop our own ecosystem, our own innovation hubs, our own accelerators, I think seeing this, touching, feeling it, seeing the transformation, seeing how quickly you've made it happen, is a testament to what is possible. So I believe all of us leave here stronger than ever.
The Working Group of Experts on Subnational Competitiveness, the GTEX, is our gateway program to promote local economic competitiveness policies alongside municipal and state-level governments, together with the private sector and academia.
Este tipo de reuniones te sirven para darte cuenta de todo lo que se está viviendo en América Latina sobre los temas de competitividad. Y hoy justamente en este sector estamos viendo sobre todo los temas de innovación tecnológica, pues que si hablamos de competitividad tenemos que hablar de tecnología. Y me está ayudando mucho para ver el panorama de ver lo que están haciendo otras ciudades y lo que podemos llegar a aplicar también nosotros en México.
The Hub on the Transfer and Commercialization of Technology is connecting and strengthening national innovation ecosystems in the region. Each edition of the Hub trains budding technology entrepreneurs from the region's public and private sectors to take promising products and services from idea to market.
¿Por qué es importante que estemos juntos en esto? Porque la región tiene que estar unida y me parece que hay mucho conocimiento en la región que todavía no está explotado comercialmente como podría ser, y esta es la mejor manera de hacerlo.
Tenemos la proyección de cada año generar y compartir nuevas experiencias entre aquellos que contribuyen a la innovación. Queremos cambiar el cómo lo hemos estado haciendo en Latinoamérica. Queremos generar la unión de los países, queremos colaborar.
Our virtual platform on technology foresight, Prospecta Americas, will support OAS member states in identifying and mapping future trends and technological development of critical importance for the Americas.
Este esfuerzo, el cual viene siendo apoyado por la Organización de los Estados Americanos, nos permitirá tener una gran información para poder mapear estas iniciativas de innovación y poder que ellas contribuyan al crecimiento económico, a la competitividad y al bienestar de nuestras naciones.
Como bien sabemos, nos encontramos ya en la cuarta revolución industrial, la que está cambiando rápidamente la forma en que se hace negocio, se produce, se consume y se genera bienestar y entretenimiento en el mundo. Es la mayor amenaza, tal vez la mejor oportunidad que tenemos en nuestras naciones.
The Inter-American Teacher Education Network, the I-10, is working to improve the quality of teachers with an emphasis on science, technology, engineering, and mathematics education. In 2019, the I-10 launched the first STEM Teacher Fellowship of the Americas. The Energy and Climate Partnership of the Americas, ECPA, is working with governments in the Caribbean to advance electric mobility and clean transport as the sub-region pursues energy independence. Under our Integrated Water Resources Management Program, SETI is responding to the demand of member states for platforms and applications that enable data-driven policies. In the Central American region, for example, we are expanding the scope of Costa Rica's Plataforma Interactiva de Aplicación del Clima Tropical. This tool captures and disseminates real-time climate and water data, promoting resilient agriculture. The Inter-American Committee on Ports is building human and institutional capacity through public-private partnerships to address port modernization, logistics, and security. CooperaNet, SETI's multi-stakeholder platform for cooperation and partnerships, is being relaunched in 2019, responding to member states' call for a more robust hub for cooperation. In a region where 8 out of 10 consumers begin or end their shopping process online, SETI has entered into a partnership with the private sector.
Es una herramienta que sin duda acerca a las MIPYMES hacia la demanda que hoy está migrando a Internet, y con eso pretendemos mejorar las ventas y el posicionamiento de las empresas pequeñas.
As we look to the future, the Executive Secretariat for Integral Development will continue to leverage cooperation and partnerships to expand our reach, proving that together we are much more than the sum of our 34 member states.
Me and my kids have been there for over an year right now. And children are friends. It doesn't matter where they come from.
welcome to today's joint special meeting of the Committee on Inter-American Summits Management and Civil Society Participation in OAS Activities and the Committee on Juridical and Political Affairs. The subject of the meeting today will be democratic resiliency, the role of the Inter-American Democratic Charter, and the summit's process. Thank you for your presence and participation in this session. The agenda for this special joint meeting was approved by the CISC on April 6th, 2021 and distributed as document CP/CISC-994/21, Add 1 Rev 3. We have a very busy agenda today, so I would like to remind all of our special guests and panelists to please keep their presentations under 7 minutes. There will be a chronometer on the screen of the meeting platform. I will ask speakers to close their interventions if I find it to be necessary in the interest of time and for allowing all guests and participants to use the time that is set aside for them. As chair of the CISC, I would like to, first of all, express my appreciation to the organizers of this special session, the Summit of the Americas Secretariat, and the Secretariat of the CISC and of the CAJP. This has not been an easy task, we know. Indeed, we received a mandate from the 50th regular session of the OAS General Assembly through its resolution AG/RES 2948, support for and follow-up to the Summit of the American Process, which requested, quote, the CISC collaborate with the Committee on Juridical and Political Affairs to help organize, in coordination with the Summit of the Americas Secretariat, a special joint session during the first quarter of 2021 on democratic resiliency, the role of the Inter-American Democratic Charter, and the summit's process, with the goal of sharing possible recommendations for consideration with the Summit Implementation Review Group, the SIRG, in advance of the 9th Summit of the Americas, unquote. I would like to especially welcome and thank for being present here today, Mr. Secretary General Almagro, and my co-chair in this meeting, Ambassador Josué Viaggio, who is the chair of the Committee on Juridical and Political Affairs, as well as permanent representative of the Dominican Republic to the OAS. I would like to also welcome and thank every one of the panelists who kindly accepted our invitation to be present here today. This meeting would not fulfill the mandate we received and would not have the high level participation and results that we expect without your contributions. The biographies of the panelists and the guests may be found in the agenda for this meeting under their names. Last but not least, I would like to welcome and thank for joining us here today the permanent and alternate representatives of the member states to the OAS, representatives from the OAS permanent observers, civil society organizations, and other social actors, including the academia, staff of the OAS General Secretariat, and all those who are here due to their interest in the work of the CISC and the CAJP, but also because they follow our discussions on the Inter-American Democratic Charter and or the Summits of the Americas process. Since this meeting is being broadcast today, I also welcome the public who are watching this event. The United States is proud to again demonstrate our commitment to the people and the governments of the Western Hemisphere by hosting the 9th Summit of the Americas. The leaders of our hemisphere mandated the adoption of the Inter-American Democratic Charter at the 2001 Summit of the Americas in Quebec City. It was adopted nearly 5 months later on one of the darkest days in modern U.S. history, September 11th, 2001. As we approach the 20th anniversary of the Charter, the commitments enshrined within it remain. They remain just as relevant today, and it is all the more urgent we fulfill them. In preparation for the 9th Summit, today's meeting will help identify common priorities for our hemisphere and consider strategies for effective democracy resilience in addressing the COVID-19 pandemic. The timing of this meeting is important, given many of the challenges facing our region, most notably in Nicaragua and Venezuela, but elsewhere as well. The pandemic has further complicated efforts to promote democracy, development, human rights, and security in the region. This illustrates that we must renew our commitment to do more to deepen and defend democracy and human rights. And we must forge a common path forward that empowers us to do so together. We welcome the discussion today, and I would like to now turn to Ambassador Viaggio for his remarks. And noting that I have just spoken for 6 minutes, I turn the floor over to you, Ambassador, Chair of the CAJP. You now have the floor. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente. Buenas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good afternoon, everyone. I would like to begin by extending a cordial welcome to Chair Bradley Friden, Interim Permanent Representative of the United States, and thank the delegation for all of the work that has gone into making this a possibility. I would like to also acknowledge Luis Almagro, Secretary General of the organization, as well as all of our panelists today, distinguished ambassadors, panelists, and delegates. This year, we mark the 20th anniversary of the adoption by acclamation of the Inter-American Democratic Charter. In the lead up to this celebration, the countries in our hemisphere are facing major challenges that continue to affect our society in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic and its impact on the economy, society, and political processes. In that regard, I would like to highlight how important the Inter-American Democratic Charter is. It is an instrument whose values and mechanisms make it possible to make progress in this emergency situation because they allow for concerted solutions in order to improve the constitutional order and democracy. What happens at this OAS will be an important step in addressing these challenges, given that our organization is the political forum par excellence in bringing together government, civil society, the private sector, academia, workers, and others. Therefore, we have a vital role in helping to find solutions in order to continue strengthening democracy, increasing transparency, and the separation of powers throughout the hemisphere. Now, we also have additional challenges from the COVID-19 pandemic. We know that there is a triple agenda to address because of all of this. The challenges that are still unresolved from the past, because there weren't preventive mechanisms. The current situation now as well, that we see in the challenges around democracy and what has come from COVID-19, as well as the potential opportunities in order to better navigate the future and move towards more participatory and inclusive societies. We hope that through this joint meeting, we're able to identify the prevailing shared problems in our societies, but also look at best practices and be able to look at strategies in order to achieve effective democratic resiliency. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ambassador Viaggio, and thank you for your support in the preparation of this special joint meeting. Secretary General Almagro, you now have the floor.
Colegas, amigas, amigos.
Thank you, colleagues, friends, permanent and alternate representatives, experts. It is a pleasure to be here as we mark this 20th anniversary of the aspiration of the Inter-American Democratic Charter, which is the main Inter-American instrument to advance and strengthen the principles of democracy and the democratic culture of our states. The Charter is a product of the work that we have done in order to improve government systems. The Charter is an instrument that was a result of a process that went for many years and went through many consultations between the OAS and civil society and member countries. It was adopted in Lima, Peru on September 11th, which was a day that was tragic, that had to do with what happened. It is the only region in the world that is free of armed conflict, but the countries in the Americas express the solidarity and understand that we can all come together in order to face these challenges. And through the Charter, governments are asked to contribute to a hemisphere that is based on freedoms and social justice that have created and can create conditions where everyone can achieve their full potential. The essence of the Charter is to ensure that all peoples in the Americas can exercise their right to democracy, and the governments have to promote this and make it possible. We should never forget this principle, particularly at a time when democracy is at risk. The origin of this democratic charter goes back to the OAS's foundation in 1948. And this charter builds on the original charter of the organization. When heads of state and governments can bring together foreign ministers in order to put together these charters in order to strengthen our instruments, make it easier to combat these issues. This process has concluded with a legal framework that is focusing on strengthening all of society. Thanks to that legal system, we can look at the Declaration of Santiago from 1959, which determines the attributes to be hailed. Also the Cartagena Protocol that takes into account the non-intervention principles of the OAS, the resolution of the General Assembly of 1989 on human rights and electoral observation, and the powers given to the Secretary General in order to carry out the mandate for electoral observation. Also the Commitment of Santiago, 1991, as well as the resolution from the General Assembly 1080 on representative democracy, which allows the OAS to take steps and impose sanctions when there is a violation of the Constitution. The Inter-American Democratic Charter has been around for 2 decades, and this has been an important period for the region. We've seen democracy, but also authoritarianism, as well as other steps taken by governments to oppress the people. There have been a number of issues that have been addressed by the Charter in order to recognize that anyone who is behind a violation or a disruption of the Constitution need to be addressed in order to keep them from being able to benefit from these violations. This is a key point. And many times this is what can come from a majority, but the principles of the Democratic Charter and the principles of democracy have to do with the separation of powers and independence of powers. And this means, ultimately, that what is important is the rule of law. Majority voting does not allow for co-opting powers and branches of the government. Majority voting does not provide anyone with the power to take over any of the branches. Governments need to ensure that democracy is preserved. We see the need for these instruments and also the need for ensuring that this instrument works better. COVID-19 has had a strong impact on a number of countries in our region, and it has pulled back the veil on a number of some of the underlying problems that we've had in our societies for very long. This is why we're here as part of this special meeting that is a joint meeting of the CISC and the CAJP to talk about this charter, which reveals the main principles of democracy and gives us the mechanisms to defend it. It is on us to strengthen and enforce those principles that are all fundamental to our democracies. It is on us to ensure that this is all preserved. At this crucial time when our countries are addressing and trying to respond to the pandemic, they must also strengthen democracy. We must also ensure that there is better governance and transparency and more combating of authoritarianism and corruption, to ensure that there's no co-opting of any of the branches of government and that there is no exploitation of politics for personal gain. This is a charter that was carefully designed, and it has two very important components. The one that is best known has to do with the restorative component, what to do when there's a number of different constitutional and legal standards that are used to violate democracy and the Constitution. But the Charter calls on member countries in the Inter-American system to take preventive measures in order to strengthen the quality of our democratic practices and ensure transparency, responsibility, and civic participation and engagement. Over the last 20 years, since the Charter has been around, the organization has taken a number of steps to address the key issues that are part of the Charter, having to do with a preventive nature of the Charter, like, for example, looking at transparency, public administration, and ensuring there is freedom of the press and freedom of speech, and also ensuring that political parties can carry out their duties, and also to ensure that there are free and fair elections. Also, the Charter has helped to support capacity building for preventive action in different countries. There are special missions, and the use of good offices from the Secretary General has always helped to strengthen the Charter. Our recent efforts, even in a number of countries in the region, show the ongoing commitment that we have with the spirit of the Charter. There is still a long road ahead, and we need to ensure that all of our contributions are constructive. On the important point of elections, it is absolutely key that all necessary steps are taken in order to ensure that there is timely holding and safe and secure holding of elections. The Charter captures the principle that is enshrined in what electoral observation missions do, gives them the necessary instruments as well to ensure that they can contribute to democracy. On the occasion of this 20th anniversary of the Charter, there are a number of different figures from the region who have been gathered here in order to share insights. And also, we have with us people who advocate for governance and democracy. Now, of course, this Charter is not focused on intervention or meddling. These are concepts that are anachronic and they no longer have a place in our modern history. This Charter is fully in line with the founding charter of the organization. When we talk about legal issues within countries, there is no talk about interference, but rather ensuring that there is protection of human rights. These are not issues that only fall on domestic governments, but rather on our entire system to ensure that human rights are respected and observed. And that makes us all responsible for democracy, as we see in Article 20. Today is a day of celebration, but the reasons that brought us to enact this charter reminds us that we need to continue deepening our lessons learned, deepening our conversations in order to address the challenges we have before us. Thank you very much.
Secretary General, for your remarks, for having accepted our invitation to participate in this meeting, and for the support we have received from the General Secretariat who made this meeting possible. We're very grateful. Let us proceed now with the next agenda item. Our first panel is a thematic discussion on democracy outcomes of the summit's process and the road to the 9th summit, which will consist of presentations by 6 experts. I will serve as the moderator for this panel. To begin, I'd like to offer the floor to Ambassador James Lambert, the OAS Secretary for Hemispheric Affairs, who oversees the summits of the Americas Secretariat. Ambassador Lambert and the Secretariat staff play an integral role in supporting the summit process, and I thank them for their support of the United States as we prepare to host the 9th Summit. Ambassador Lambert, the floor is yours.
Secretary General Almagro, and thank you very much, Bradley Frieden, Interim Permanent Representative of the United States, Ambassador Josue Fiallo, Your Excellency President Chinchilla, and other distinguished experts with whom I share this panel. I'm very pleased to join with you today with such a renowned group of experts to celebrate the 20th anniversary of the Inter-American Democratic Charter, which is the main inter-American instrument for the promotion and strengthening of democracy in the Americas. The convening of this special joint session of the CISC and the CAJP committees of the Permanent Council, which the Summit Secretariat has been supporting and promoting, shows the political commitment of the OAS to the effective application of the Inter-American Democratic Charter in the promotion and the defense of the principles of representative democracy in the region, as Secretary General Almagro has just alluded to very forcefully. This 20-year celebration coincides with the preparation phases of the 9th Summit of the Americas, in which the United States is once again in the chair for the first time since the first Summit of the Americas, which was held in Miami in 1994. And the history of the Charter is very much intertwined with that of the Summits of the Americas. The leaders of the Americas at the very first summit highlighted that the strengthening, effective exercise, and consolidation of democracy constitute the fundamental political priorities for the Americas. And they reiterated the OAS as the main hemispheric body for the defense of democratic values and institutions. Since that very first meeting, there have been several milestones deriving from the summit's process, which have had a long-term impact on the Inter-American system. I mention as example the preparation and approval of the Inter-American Convention Against Corruption, the very first international instrument of its nature to combat corruption, as well as the role of the right to freedom of thought and expression in the consolidation of democracy with the creation of the Office of the Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Expression, which has allowed several of the acts that threaten freedom of expression, such as physical or verbal violence, as well as acts of censorship, to be denounced and monitored. This is another summit outcome. Particularly noteworthy was the decisive impulse that gave birth to the Charter, which originated at the meeting of hemispheric heads of state and government in Quebec City in 2001. And two decades have passed since that third Summit of the Americas promoted the foundation of democracy with the approval of the Democratic Clause and called for the elaboration of the Democratic Charter as an instrument to which the OAS member states could utilize when democratic institutions and constitutional norms were being threatened. As we know, democratic governance goes well beyond the exercise of the voting franchise, and the risks to democracy in the region may be less likely to manifest themselves in the form of a dramatic rupture of constitutional fabric than from day-to-day erosion of democratic norms and practices, including the separation of powers. Conscious of this, the 8th Summit of the Americas, held in Peru in 2018, approved the Lima Commitment, which saw the adoption of a regional undertaking to combat one of the greatest and most corrosive threats to democracy, the ever-present specter of corruption. Through concrete measures on access to information, the financing of political parties, transparency in public contracting, asset recovery, and measures against international bribery, the Lima Summit proved again the importance of leader-led diplomacy to set the level of expectation and democratic practice in the hemisphere. It is a fact, nevertheless, that the popular perception of the Charter is as a means to correct one-off systemic disruptions that undermine constitutional norms and order. And the high-profile cases of its application have been largely in this restorative sense of the Charter. However, and without diminishing the importance of placing the bandages once the wounds are inflicted, it is worth noting that the Charter also refers, as the Secretary General mentioned, to a series of preventative actions that signatories should undertake to deter in advance the possible erosion of democratic practice. This area of preventing corruption and reinforcing democratic governance is one that falls squarely into the competence of the OAS. The importance of reinforcing open and transparent governance is referred to in Article 4, or the critically important civic education and robust participation of civil society are also elements that are emphasized in the Charter. Unlike addressing a specific democratic rupture, this requires ongoing engagement. It's also a project that requires investment in the technical capabilities of governments in the region to help them achieve their own objectives in transparent and open governance. Here too, there is much room for improvement, for the leaders of the region have asked us to better align the resources of the inter-American institutions and system to achieve this part of the charter. The so-called Joint Summit Working Group of Multilateral Institutions has made great strides in arming this type of coordinated action in the follow-up to the Lima Commitment and during the COVID pandemic meetings, which were convened by the Secretary General and the Director of PAHO over this last year. But important challenges remain. And while it may be political in nature, the solution can be greatly advanced through technical cooperation that reinforces and buttresses our democratic practices. I would also like to highlight the importance of the participation of civil society and social actors, including centers of thought and academia, which we have been working tirelessly within the framework of the summit's process, and whose contributions are key to the construction and implementation of the hemispheric agenda. I hope that today's reflection will contribute to the exchange of perspectives, experiences, and innovative ideas on strengthening democratic governance ahead of the next summit and the 20th anniversary of the approval of the Inter-American Democratic Charter, a session in which the recommendations can be reached for the consideration of the summit's implementation and review group in this key stage of the preparation of the 9th Summit of the Americas. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ambassador Lambert. We appreciate not only the presentation, but of course the support that you and your team give to us and give to the summit's process in a wide variety of areas. Before introducing the next presentation, I want to apologize. I was remiss in not recognizing Assistant Secretary General Nestor Mendez, who is also with us here today. Perhaps because I didn't see his face, only the image is blacked out now. There you are. Please accept my apologies, Assistant ASG. We are so pleased to have you here, and thank you for all the support for the summit process. I'd like to now offer the floor to Mrs. Delia Ferreira Rubio, the Chair of Transparency International. Ms. Ferreira Rubio, the floor is now yours.
Muchas gracias, señor embajador. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you, Secretary General Almagro, for the invitation to Transparency International to take part of this meeting. There's nothing more timely than to underscore the importance of democracy in these times that the hemisphere, particularly the regions, experiencing. More than a resilient democracy, what I see is a democracy under threat and challenge democracy. And therefore, more than ever, what's important is to reflect the principles of the Democratic Charter, which have been underscored by Secretary Almagro, and reinforce the importance of the summit's mechanism, as has been done by Ambassador Lambert just before me. What we've seen since the pandemic began has been the use of the pandemic as an excuse to degrade democratic principles by concentration power in the executive branch and taking over legislative functions by the executive branch, and a lack of respect of the principles of rule of law and overstepping the bounds with regard to individual liberties and standards with regard to emergencies. We've seen as well the breakdown of the division of branches of government, and with regard to the rights of populations in quarantine, what we've seen is the national constitutions and mechanisms of control, audit, and transparency have been quarantined, is what I would say. So in light of this reality of the pandemic, we've seen increased corruption throughout the region. In March of last year, all chapters of international transparency noticed or warned that any humanitarian emergency involves an increase in risk of corruption, and they point out what the troubled areas were and what can be done to avoid these risks. Unfortunately, the year has gone by. What we've seen is confirmation of these warnings that were issued. We've seen a clear increase in corruption, particularly in responses to the pandemic when it comes to what we can call COVID contracts. This has entailed contracts that have been without any oversight. We've seen overcharging of goods, a lack of due diligence, and many conflicts of interest between those who were contracted by the state and by the state actors and suppliers, very linked to corruption, where we've seen abuses have been in distribution of aid packages and the use of loans and aid packages from multilateral organizations. In these areas, we've seen clear patronage, that is, privileged allotment of the right to subsidies in persons who were not qualified. Third major issue we've seen corruption is vaccinations, both in acquiring the vaccinations, characterized by absolute opacity and a lack of respect for the right to access of public information, as well as in the distribution of the vaccines, where we've seen once again privilege of certain vaccines in several different countries of the region. This clearly breaches the commitments undertaken in Lima at the 8th summit. We also have noticed the politicization of and co-opting of the judiciary, the use of anti-corruption fight as a weapon against the opposition, and in addition, an attempt to judicialize politics and processes that had begun to put an end to impunity in this area. The independence of the judiciary and oversight mechanism is a sine qua non condition to fight against corruption. Lastly, we've also seen an attack on civil society organizations, an assault on freedom of the press and freedom of expression and free access to communication mechanism through social networks, etc. This is very notable in certain countries, and this entails a risk for the participation of civil society. With regard to what's coming down the pike at the 9th summit, two things to emphasize: the work being done by the chapters of international transparency and other civil society organizations through their citizens observatories on corruption. Enrique Barrios, I'm sure he will discuss this. But for the 9th summit, we need a reinforcement of the importance of transparency and integrity as basic principles, and the importance of the struggle against corruption, and the commitment of Lima does not exhaust this issue in the region. And lastly, including a special meeting of open dialogue and accountability by the states when it comes to compliance or failure to comply with the commitments in the under the commitment of Lima. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ms. Ferreira, for your presentation and for all of the work that GI does in the fight against corruption. And as well, thank you for keeping your remarks under 7 minutes. I'd like to offer the floor now to Professor Ruben Perina, international consultant and former professor at George Washington University and Georgetown University. Professor Perina, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Greetings to the Secretary General and the members of the Permanent Council, as well as to my fellow panelists and the organization officials that have organized the event. It's an honor to be here because I worked for more than 20 years at the OAS. My presentation consists of some thoughts about how to strengthen the democratic charter. As we know, in addition to the charter of the organization, the democratic charter is the main diplomatic and legal instrument that member states of the organization have to defend democracy in the hemisphere. What I'd like to do is sort of update some suggestions that I made in my book on the OAS, which was published in 2015, to strengthen preventive and restorative sides to the charter. The OAS has to be able to respond to threats of the democratic. The preventive side is to, when a government sees that democratic institutions are threatened and requests assistance to the Secretary General or the Permanent Council in the framework of Article 17 of the Charter, such as in what happened in Bolivia in 2005 and 2008, in Nicaragua in 2005, in Ecuador in 2005 and 2010, in other cases. The preventive side includes just a resolution of the Permanent Council to condemn the threat against democratic order and a request of a report on the situation and sending a good officer's mission to help with negotiations to solve the crisis. The problem is, however, that when the threat to the democratic order comes from the executive branch via a veiled slow motion coup and persecution against the opposition in the media, and a democratically elected government, that means, that becomes autocratic, if not democratic. Governments of this type, such as Maduro's in Venezuela and Ortega in Venezuela, don't allow any good offices mission to come in, or for the Permanent Council to create any solution or help in the negotiations. A preventive side is even more hampered because only the executive branch is able to invoke the charter. When there is a conflict between the executive, between the electoral power or the legislative, it's the executive is the only one who could. It should be logical that any branch of government could invoke the charter, that all member states are democracies and they should be able to do this. One first suggestion would be to institutionalize the creation of working groups of the Permanent Council, such as was done with Nicaragua. When a country in crisis doesn't allow the Secretary General to learn about the situation on the ground, would have been useful in Honduras before the 2009 coup. In the preventive side, I would invite or urge the headquarters for representatives of everyone involved in the crisis to engage in negotiations when there's a rupture in democratic order. And this shows how the organization and the charter can prevent these conflicts. Another way of preventing it is supporting in the long run, for example, technical cooperation programs to strengthen the legislative branches and democracy education. This would be my second suggestion. And thirdly, there could be better awareness raising could be done of the charter, supporting academic institutions or diplomatic institutions to provide courses on this. Fourthly, on the subject, also call on the member states to reincorporate the charter into their constitutions, as has been done by some of the countries have done with the American Convention on Human Rights. Lastly, the restorative function invokes Article 20 by the Secretary General of the Permanent Council when there's a very serious breakdown in constitutional order. If this involves a coup such as in Haiti or Honduras or Nicaragua, the states will not hesitate in activating the charter. They will hear condemnations and calls for return to democracy after attempts to restore democracy. But if this fails, should this fail, then diplomatic sanctions will enter into force, economic and diplomatic sanctions, and there will be a possibility of suspension. However, when the democratic order breakdown is veiled, such as a slow motion coups which has happened in several countries, the origin of the governments often is from democratic elections, and this is very troublesome. 10 years have gone by to recognize that in Venezuela there's a dictatorship. My suggestion today is to call for a study to identify events that would constitute a serious disruption of democratic order and an appropriate response of states. So, in conclusion, it's clear that the usefulness of the charter as an instrument to prevent ruptures of breakdowns of democratic order, it depends on the consensus that exists as to what is a breakdown in democratic order. If there's no consensus, this won't work. The charter won't work, and there will be collective chaos. And so for me, today in the Americas, the commitment to democratics and collective defense is the main priority, and it goes beyond the commitment to absolute sovereignty and non-intervention. These are principles that democratic and tyrannic regimes use to cover up their putting an end to democracy. To paraphrase Thomas Franklin Fernando Sassoon, the states that commit to defend democracy and human rights cede sovereignty. They cede absolute sovereignty, and they can invoke the principle of non-intervention to cover up their actions. This is the price they have to pay to belong to a community of democratic nations. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Medina, for your presentation and for your service as an educator and promoter both in and outside the OAS. Now, I would like to offer the floor to Evelyn Marino, former Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Expression of the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights, the OAS. Also a member of the Friends of the Democratic Charter.
Gracias, embajador, y gracias a la OEA por.
Thank you, Ambassador, and the OAS for the invitation. The question that was posed to me when I was invited was whether the summit mechanism has had any impact on the right to freedom of expression. And the answer is, without doubt, no question, it has. Way beyond rhetorical declarations, the mechanism of the summits, and it is in a very important Latin American context, push forward not only the most important decisions of the Inter-American system with regard to freedom of expression of the Court and the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, but the creation of the Special Rapporteur for freedom of expression. At the summit, the first summit is when discussion began on this. But it wasn't until Santiago de Chile, that summit, when these commitments materialized. And that's not a coincidence, because at that time, there was a context in where only 2 countries of the region didn't have democratic governments, Cuba and Peru with Fujimori. The rest of the countries of the region are trying to reestablish their democracies. They're trying to open up space to oxygenate themselves and to do away with authoritarianism and military dictatorships. When there's authoritarianism and military dictatorship, but any type of authoritarianism, when this happens, even veiled authoritarianism or electoral authoritarianism, as it's called, the first thing to do is to put away with the freedom of expression. They dilute the courts and independent voices and the media. They threaten journalists. They throw people in jail who criticize. and they adopt mechanisms that smother any expression of criticism, and this is seen throughout the countries of the region. Particularly at the time of the Summit of Santiago, that's when they got together. They talked about democracy and human rights, and particularly freedom of expression. This is a very important summit of all the summits that were held, because the countries, particularly in the Southern Cone, who had emerged from these horrible dictatorships, and they're embarrassed about it, and they wanted to again strengthen their institutions, and so in Quebec, at the Quebec Summit, there's reinforcement of the support for the Rapporteur for Freedom of Expression. They adopted a specific action with regard to freedom of expression, financed by the rapporteurship is financed, and the commission that has all of its activities that have to do with freedom of expression to raise awareness of freedom of expression throughout. These governments believed in the importance and independence of the judiciary. And that's why they felt that even that judges had better decision had to be shared throughout the region. They adopted the decision and the plan of action to bring their domestic provisions in line with promoting freedom of expression, and to make that opinion leaders, journalists, and other people such as human rights defenders could investigate and publish their results of their investigation without any fear of retaliation, without fear of being persecuted, without fear of being stigmatized. So the states ensured a space for criticism. There's nothing more democratic. And then that the following 2006, the following up to 2009, the summits, there is a reinforcement of human rights defense. And then comes the summit, which again will be held in the United States, the 9th summit. And I believe this one has to revive, so to speak, and salvage. It's not only about democratic resilience, but huge fragility. And what should be done as a result at this time? Declare their support to the Inter-American Human Rights Protection System, to the Inter-American Court and Commission of Human Rights. 2, to push forward enforcement domestically of these international instruments. And 3, to discuss again international commitments of the states and how to demand states to meet their own obligations and not call criticism from outside interference. And when you cede sovereignty, you have to be willing when you're called out on not meeting your obligations. There's been serious breach of obligation when it comes to protecting freedom of expression and defend the right to information, particularly during this pandemic, which should be recalled robustly and vigorously at an upcoming summit. Thank you, Ambassador, once again for the opportunity to take part.
Thank you very much, Ms. Botero, for your presentation, and as well for your service to the IACHR and the OAS as a former rapporteur for freedom of expression, and as well for being part of the group of friends of the Inter-American Democratic Charter. Your service to the hemisphere spans covers a wide swath and continues to this day. So thank you. Now I would like to offer the floor to Mr. Enrique Del Barrio, the General Coordinator of Red Latinoamericana y del Caribe para la Democracia, que se pronuncia Red Lat.
You have the floor. Thank you very much, Chair, Secretary General, Assistant Secretary General, Ambassador Fiallo, distinguished panelists that have joined me here. Greetings friends, I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to join you in this dialogue on the Inter-American Democratic Charter and the Summit of the Americas process. Two subjects of deep interest to civil society, and particularly for the Latin American Caribbean Network for Democracy, which is I'm honored to head, Redland. But firstly, we have to recognize that the Charter has meant over these years, 20 years now, an opportunity for civil society to defend and promote human rights. Even though its application and compliance have been a huge challenge, which has not been without controversy, difficulties, and absences. One of the main difficulties of the Charter are this few mechanisms to urge a country to comply with the basic conditions to ensure full democracy. We have clear examples of countries that stay in crisis despite many initiatives that have been put forward to ensure dignity of their citizens. We are facing a recipe that has been used in several countries, the consequences of which we're all too familiar with: systematic violations of human rights, institutions that are co-opted and that serve private interests, persecution of the opposition and the press, and proliferation of corrupt practices in the management of the state. We have, therefore, a panorama before us that should lead us to reflect on what full democracy really means. Is it, as put forward in the Inter-American Democratic Charter and other treaties in all constitutions of OAS member countries, one that, of course, goes beyond just holding free elections every once in a while? 2 decades after approving and signing the Charter, our political systems are going through personalist leadership crisis with all political stripes, and with abuses of democratic systems by traditional politicians and corruption, and in response to unresolved social issues, challenge the minimum of democratic society, plural democratic society, and these people want to act as the only voices. They've co-opted the leadership and civil society and normalize violence and corruption as political instruments. We must continue strengthening and expanding spaces for dialogue, even though we generally observe their willingness to take part at the OAS with a variety of social actors. They don't do this at home, nor has it been successful at creating real dialogue, but just a monologue, these countries, that is, because the methods they use prevent it, or the actors don't have the willingness. It's imperative to facilitate the strengthening of democratic practices, human rights, and fundamental freedoms. Create spaces of real and constructive dialogue between the OAS member states and civil society and the private sector and other social, political, cultural, and economic actors. We cannot continue to move forward in silos. The COVID-19 pandemic is a good juncture to try to attempt this, because unprecedented places is where the states and governments and civil society and private sector find themselves in. It's led to the limits of our resources and has uncovered the need to work as a team in the same national, continental, and global agenda. With regard to the summits of the Americas, I believe, and I attended all of them, it continues to be the scenario of political exchange par excellence on the continent. The last summit in Lima in 2018 moved forward in doing something innovative. It created a solid reporting system on progress. It, in and of itself, is a best practice that should be maintained and reinforced. Another best practice that we can underscore is the work that has been done by civil society to create specialized support groups to the process of the summits with a geographic, populational, and thematic approaches. Especially the action that we coordinated At Red Light, with a PASCA process and Citizen Forum of the Americas, with a plural group of organizations from 15 countries who coordinate activities based on their local efforts with an intersectional look, point of view and dialogue. And based on this work, there has been an active, purpose-driven, diverse, and permanent participation at the OAS. Furthermore, the coordination with the chapters of Transparency International, we've created the Citizen Observatory on Corruption, a multi-sectoral space that combines technical experience to fight this issue and recognizing social process and political process from a citizen's point of view, and with people from 19 countries. To conclude, the road we're going down with this summit is recommendable to take into account the agendas that have been prioritized by civil society to build on these times. At Red Light and Foro Ciudadano de las Americas, we've identified the following issues: increase in poverty and inequality, serious weakness of the health systems of our countries, gender-based violence, growth of authoritarianism and reduction of an alarming civic or space and respect for human rights, and corruption and lack of access to accurate and timely information in the purchase and negotiations associated with priority care for COVID-19. To deal at these issues in a frank, plural, and multi-actor dialogue is key for democratic resiliency and rule of law in the Americas. That's why we propose to dream, to do away for a second with the formalities that our positions or organizations impose, and imagine the conditions and guarantees that at a minimum that there should be for plural and diverse and respectful dialogue of all voices in the framework of recognition of human rights and the integrity of persons. If we wish for a full democracy is the rule and not the exception, then we should begin to democratize all spaces, including the OAS, which should not be a space where the voices of the government who are louder over the citizens are heard. The nation, the central element of all state, which includes everybody, not those who govern or those who are not governed at a given time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Ovario, for your presentation and for the work that Red Light does in supporting activism and in issuing alerts on issues of human rights and democracy, as well as Red Light's work to organize civil society participation in the Summer of the Americas. Now I would like to offer the floor to Ms. Jenny Lincoln, the Director of the Carter Center's Latin America and Caribbean Program. Ms. Lincoln, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Frieden. It is an honor to be with you in this important meeting on democratic resiliency, the role of the Inter-American Democratic Charter, and the summit processes. Thank you, Mr. Secretary General, Mr. Frieden, Ambassador Fiallo, members of the Permanent Council, for this opportunity to participate with this distinguished group of panelists, all of whom are dedicated to strengthening democracy in our hemisphere. Thank you for the opportunity to add the voices of non-governmental organizations such as the Carter Center to this discussion. In 2004, former US President Jimmy Carter convened a group of like-minded former government officials and human rights defenders to form the Friends of the Inter-American Democratic Charter to emphasize the importance of this document that was signed in Lima. We are here because we agree that democracy is the best form of government and that we support the OAS commitment to protect and defend democratic principles. The challenges we face today in this hemisphere require creativity and the ability to seize an opportunity to overcome obstacles. The consensus that produced the Inter-American Democratic Charter in September 2001 is a prime example of the collective minds working together for the greater good. It is not a perfect document, but the fact that it did not come into existence until 53 years after the formation of the Organization of American States tells us that this was a difficult task to achieve. It was difficult to come to an agreement on the principles. For the past 20 years, the Charter has provided guidance to uphold democratic institutions, protect human rights, provide for rule of law, and to instill in all citizens the responsibility to form responsible governments. Many of the challenges addressed when the Charter was signed 20 years ago still exist today. Poverty, inequality, attacks on fundamental freedoms, crime and corruption still plague governments and civil society. However, there are new challenges on the horizon which need to be considered as well. The world is experiencing a global pandemic, with some countries emerging more quickly than others. Technology is improving lives of many and leaving others behind. Therefore, as we celebrate the 20th anniversary of the Charter and look forward to the Summit of the Americas, it's an opportune moment to review the principles of the Inter-American Democratic Charter and strengthen its ability to serve the interests of the people of the hemisphere. The ninth summit could provide the opportunity to reaffirm the Inter-American Democratic Charter and offer new ways to apply its principles to reduce democratic backsliding and to provide support to democracies at risk. The opening session the democracy outcomes of the summit's process on the road to the ninth summit is the title of this session. It's been a while since there has been an evaluation of the outcomes of the summit's process. At the same time, there have been assessments of the Inter-American Democratic Charter. Professor Perlina is well known for the work that he has done on this, and he mentioned several suggestions about strengthening the Charter. Therefore, as the preparation for the summit is underway, it seems an opportune moment to consider crafting a plan of action to strengthen the Inter-American Democratic Charter for the next decade. I encourage the summit planners to consider this agenda item, and I offer the assistance of the Carter Center in any way that we may be able to help. Thank you again for the kind invitation to participate in this discussion. I think we have heard a lot of support for the Charter and also some creative notions about addressing the problems that confront us today as democracies are challenged by the pandemic and by the backsliding that is happening in the hemisphere. Now's the time. We must seize the opportunity, take this moment, and take advantage of the calendar, the fact that there'll be the summit, and the fact that the Charter is celebrating 20 years, and that hope that there'll be a celebration of another 20 years after this. Thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you, Ms. Lincoln, for your presentation and for the work that the Carter Center does in improving lives around the world, resolving conflicts, advancing democracy, and fighting disease. I would like to now thank all of our esteemed panelists for their thoughtful remarks. I will now offer the floor to those delegations who wish to speak on the issues under consideration on the first panel. Please keep in mind that the next panel starts at 4 p.m. The chair recognizes the chair recognizes the delegation of Paraguay.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Paraguay welcomes the opportunity to be part of this joint special meeting of the CISC and CJP and participation of civil society and OAS activities on the issue of democratic resiliency, the role of the Inter-American Democratic Charter and the summit's process. We fully understand how important the Democratic Charter is and the need to continue building on its principles and on its purpose as we mark its 20th year. This instrument helps us to reflect political will, and we have heard many governments talk about the essential elements of democracy. We have heard a number of issues be brought up given what is happening in countries, and that there is a need for preserving the rule of law in our countries. And this charter continues to be as important as ever, and it can be used by all governments who want to stand up for democracy and for the kinds of elements that need to be included in our societies. We need to continue working on this, and not just with words, but also with action. Given the challenges that we are facing now, given what is happening with the pandemic, or what is happening politically, or some of the economic challenges that have come from the current circumstances, we would very much welcome the Ninth Summit of the Americas as being the forum to discuss these issues. Seeing as 20 years in, we need to be able to show resilience to all attacks against democracy. It's important also, in order to improve the human rights situation in our hemisphere. Also, we need to continue to be transparent and continue to speak up about defending democracy in the Americas. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much to the esteemed delegation of Paraguay. The chair would like to recognize the permanent representative of Costa Rica, Her Excellency Ambassador Alejandro Solano. Embajadora, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, co-chair, distinguished co-chairs, distinguished Secretary General, Assistant Secretary General, distinguished panelists, colleagues, attendees of this very important meeting. Costa Rica appreciates the very important comments made today, and also would like to take this opportunity to reiterate the commitment of my country to build this road towards the 9th Summit of the Americas as we commemorate the 20th anniversary of the Inter-American Democratic Charter. With a hemispheric vision, my delegation urges all members of the organization to make the most of the opportunities we have in order to work on the issues that bring us together, in order to address the biggest challenges in our region that have been aggravated and compounded by the health crisis we're currently experiencing. We've seen the economic slowdown, the increase in poverty, increased unemployment, also rising inequality, as well as the loss of biodiversity and climate change, just to mention some of the challenges we're facing. Costa Rica, therefore, urges the use of all of the tools in our multilateral arsenal. Particularly, as we commemorate today, we have the Inter-American Democratic Charter, which is a hemispheric instrument that can help improve lives for people through a sustainable and green and inclusive economic recovery that can also bring about digitalization and can use as a roadmap the 2030 agenda. We must continue working tirelessly to end poverty and to continue to stand up for the freedom and the human rights of all of those who live in our countries, leaving no one behind. That is because it is a mandate, but also the right thing to do and an ethical imperative. We need to use all resources available in order to continue making headway with our agendas, which require peace and security as well. To support developing countries, as particularly low-income countries, we have submitted an initiative to create a fund in order to address the economic challenges from COVID-19. This is going to be a special support fund with concessional terms and long-term vision so that 80% of the GDP of the global group of economies, the largest economies, can help developing countries through an equivalent of what would be about 3% of the GDP. We support the Pan American group and ECLAC, which have helped us with this initiative. We believe that we need to do this work democratically and for our democracies, which means that we need to take increasingly strong steps, but also respect the separation of powers and the rule of law and the voice of the people as part of our robust democracies. Democracy cannot be indifferent to hunger. Democracy cannot grow from injustice and inequality. Democracy must take on structural gaps and impunity and recognize the value of the human dignity as the founding value for human rights. We need to respect human rights, strengthen them, and ensure that they are observed. To address these challenges, there needs to be engagement from all stakeholders, from government, from civil society, and from all others in order to fully make our democracies robust. Mr. Chairman, to conclude, I would like to state that my country stands ready to continue to focus on people and to look for nature-based solutions in order to address the health, economic, and environmental crises we're facing. We need to find common ground. We need to untangle the Gordian knot that we can sometimes find in our societies and continue moving forward. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Solano. The floor would like to now recognize the permanent representative of Canada, Ambassador Hugh Adsett. Ambassador Adsett, you have the floor.
Well, thank you very much, Co-Chair Brad Frieden. It's a pleasure to see you on the screen this afternoon, and also let me greet not only Ambassador Fiallo, but also Secretary General Almagro and Assistant Secretary General Mendez. A pleasure to see you all today. I wanted to make a couple of remarks this afternoon. First, to thank the panelists that we've heard so far, and I know we have more coming, but thank you very much for organizing this important special session. As others have mentioned along similar lines, we see the pandemic, the road to the next summit and its outcomes, and efforts to strengthen democracy in the hemisphere as inextricably linked. The pandemic struck us all at a time when many in our region were already expressing dissatisfaction with our governments and the capacity of our democratic institutions to respond effectively to their needs. Mutually reinforcing health, economic crisis, heightened pressure on democratic institutions have challenged all of us and meant in many quarters that the pandemic has worked to exacerbate that dissatisfaction. The region's recovery from the pandemic presents governments of the region with a unique opportunity to rebuild citizen trust in our democratic institutions. Our efforts to build back better together must not only work to address our society's immediate health-related needs, but also to narrow the various structural gaps exposed by COVID-19, revitalize our middle classes, and draw in those who are the most vulnerable and who consistently find themselves left behind, as others have actually said just moments ago. To do so, we should seek concrete, practical ways to improve our democratic institutions and their transparency, accountability, and responsiveness to constituents, and also find ways by which we can address related long-standing issues such as corruption, impunity, gender and economic inequality, and the socio-political exclusion of marginalized communities, like the region's indigenous peoples, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, intersex, asexual, and two-spirited persons and communities, as well as migrants and refugees. The 9th Summit of the Americas provides us with a platform through which we can jointly set an ambitious and unifying agenda for the hemisphere, focused both on recovering from the multidimensional impacts of the pandemic and reinforcing our democratic governments. Our collective preparations for the summit can chart a path for an inclusive, sustainable recovery from COVID-19 and the reestablishment of the social contract that is so vital between the people of the Americas and their governments. Evidence of the role that summit diplomacy can play in catalyzing this work can be found by looking no further than the Inter-American Democratic Charter, which celebrates its 20th anniversary this year and was mentioned by several previous speakers. We remain proud in Canada that the 2001 summit and our leaders' agreement to the Democracy Clause in Quebec City helped pave the way for the adoption of the Charter later that year. Canada sees the Charter as one of the region's signature achievements and a key tool for us all as we seek to reinforce democratic resilience in the hemisphere. As we celebrate its 20th anniversary this year and prepare collectively for the 9th Summit of the Americas, we welcome the presentations we've heard and those that will be forthcoming as well as creative thinking on how we might work together to strengthen the Charter's implementation and our collective defense and promotion of democracy in the region. Canada is supportive of all efforts to explore ways in which we might use and maximize to the fullest the existing framework provided by the Charter, so that we may do more together and build unity towards effectively fulfilling our joint commitment to promote and defend democracy in the region. We've taken good note of what we have heard so far, the suggestions that have been mentioned, and I'm looking forward very much to not only the rest of the discussions this afternoon, but more productive discussions as well in the months and weeks ahead. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Adsett. The floor would now like to recognize the permanent representative of Chile, Ambassador Hernan Salinas. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Good afternoon. Co-chairs. I appreciate this joint meeting on democratic resiliency from the CISC, CHAP, and for the participation of civil society. I would also like to welcome and express my appreciation for the wonderful presentations we have heard on the Americas and our processes. Chile is committed to the summit's process of the Americas, as we have shown in our continued engagement, both in holding the second Summit of the Americas in Santiago, as well as the work done in the framework of the 8th Summit. At that point, we not only signed on to the commitments of VIVAPA and also for democratic resilience, but we also were part of the entire negotiation process and was tasked with reporting on the 57 commitments that were taken on, being one of the 18 countries that have reported on our progress between 2018 and 2020. Just one more example of my country's commitment on this process. In 2020, Chile hosted the Transparency, Ethics, and Integrity Summit in procurement and government finances, and also provided best practices. From an operations perspective, Chile continues to enjoy an ongoing relationship with the Secretariat and with the other players who are part of this process through the PASTA network, as well as other mechanisms. Chile is strongly committed to the civil society as a key player in the summit's process. Co-chairs, Chile remains strongly committed to continuing to work as we get on the road to the 9th summit. We are commemorating 20 years since the unanimous adoption of the Inter-American Democratic Charter by OAS member countries, which was a milestone in strengthening democracy. In addition to this, Chile is also having a national dialogue in order to discuss the civic engagement and civil society participation in the Summit of the Americas. We see the summit's process as the main platform for multilateral participation, where the countries that make up the Western Hemisphere all come together. In this regard, an open space that says it wants to be democratic must continue to be so. Chile believes that we need to continue strengthening democracy in the region. The 8 summits that have been held have strengthened these concepts through the different decisions that have been made during them. This is why we are working to ensure that the 9th summit is a success. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Salinas. I must apologize because I inadvertently skipped the permanent representative of Panama, Ambassador Maria Rokovich, who has always been very kind to me, and now I am in her debt. So, Ambassador, you have the floor.
No se preocupe.
Absolutely nothing to worry about, especially it was Chile, and Chile and Panama always get along. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. My delegation welcomes this joint meeting between the Commission on Juridical and Political Affairs and the Committee on Inter-American Summits Management and the participation of civil society on the road to the 9th Summit of the Americas as we commemorate the 20 years of the Charter. We also welcome the presentations made by both chairs and the work that has been done by the Secretariat. Thank you very much, Ambassador Fiallo and Representative Frieden, for what you have done in order to ensure that we are not only here, but also that we have equal representation on this panel. We would like to highlight and appreciate the participation and presentation from the different panelists. We have taken note of their presentations and highly value them. We also would like to underscore the very specific and ongoing relevance of the Charter as we go through the decades. The idea is to ensure that all of the obligations that have been freely agreed to, negotiated, and accepted by member countries of this organization are all met and upheld, and that is also an ongoing responsibility. The Charter focuses on the respect for human rights and basic freedoms as the pillars of a participatory democracy. In a country where there's no respect for human rights, can live no democracy. That being said, we must continue going forward and enhancing our democracy, a democracy that is alive, that shuts out all inequality, and that ensures that all citizens can express and exercise their rights with no distinction for gender or anything else, and to ensure that we're all involved in our democracy, because democracy without everyone is not democracy. There needs to be a categorical response from member countries of the OAS whenever there is a violation of democracy, and enforcing the Democratic Charter in line with the principle of non-intervention and not meddling in the domestic affairs of a country, that can also allow for collective action in order to ensure that there is responsible multilateralism. For this reason, we recognize the cases in which there was an enforcement, a preventive enforcement of the Charter in order to address some of the institutional and constitutional issues that could have put democracies at risk and could have led to disruptions in different countries' constitutional orders. Given what we're experiencing now, given the COVID-19 pandemic, there is a need now more than ever for modernizing the mechanisms and technologies that can address the current situations, but can also allow for the ongoing enforcement of the Democratic Charter. Co-chairman, to conclude, we would like to reiterate as a country our respect for the standards established in the Inter-American Democratic Charter and our support for the Summit of the Americas process, since this is a forum that allows us to address the topics that bring us all together as member countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Rocaberta. The chair now recognizes the permanent representative of Ecuador, Ambassador Carlos Hativa. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Co-chairs, the delegation of Ecuador is grateful for the illustrious presentation with regard to the results of the summit's process towards the 9th summit and strengthening of democratic resilience in the hemisphere. With this commemoration of another milestone of the Inter-American Democratic Charter, 20 years, this has helped to bring forward this work to improve governance based on our decisions. So this will be celebrated within an extraordinary situation, unprecedented, making very difficult. COVID-19, as it implacably moved through the world, has taken the life without discriminating against socioeconomic class, race, or anything else, and has uncovered the structural inequality in our countries. This emergency has shaken the foundations of our nation, which are the pillars of our societies, and this multidimensional effects of coronavirus has turned into a threat not only to progress of everyone, but also to democracy in the region. Ecuador recognized the OAS as the coordinator to identify issues that require urgent care with regard to health, development, and potential infringements of human rights in democratic systems. Likewise, my country is convinced of the need to give a privileged position to solidarity, cooperation, and support in a coordinated fashion between states throughout the hemisphere in the stage of post-COVID recovery. This is the most suitable forum to equitably distribute vaccinations, even though there is a lot of extra vaccination. This has been difficult to distribute, despite the fiscal crisis and serious difficulties that have been faced by the national healthcare systems, and to deal with nationals and foreigners. The Ecuadorian government has applied public policies that are based on protectionation on the most vulnerable sectors of the population, to close the gap between the inequality and eradicate inequality in everywhere, and also to include everyone so that they're able to exercise their fundamental rights and respecting differences between people. These measures always have a human rights-based approach, both intercultural and intersectional approach. And use of information technology has grown in everyday activities as a result of this, and so it's become possible. It's possible to organize activities related to health and providing health services and just marketing goods and services virtually now. We've worked to ensure access and adequate connectivity for the population, to ensure the right to education and distance work at times when coronavirus is threatening these rights and threatening the closing of these gaps. It's intolerable that these gaps exist. So the resiliency goes beyond democracy and the summits of the Americas progress, because the pandemic has been just another obstacle to this. The pandemic has deepened the basic needs of our population in our countries, and with regard to access to technology and information. In Ecuador, we recognize and we urge the Secretary to make efforts to create opportunities to address the new challenges to be under the Inter-American Democratic Charter by strengthening existing mechanisms to improve collective efforts vis-a-vis the threats to democracies. This is not about coups, but there's authoritarianism right now that we are facing in some governments. Even though they were elected, they try to perpetuate their power. To wrap up, my delegation salutes this discussion on these subjects, and it will depend on us whether the commemoration of the 20th anniversary of the Inter-American Democratic Charter and coinciding with the 9th summit become an opportunity to relaunch multilateralism and hemispheric cooperation, which are the pillars of our democracy, and to make us more inclusive and supportive to each other. Thank you very much, co-chairs.
Thank you, Ambassador Hatiba. The chair would like to now recognize the permanent mission of Brazil, its senior representative, Mr. Gabriel Moreira. Sir, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Chair. I would first like to congratulate the chair of CISC and the CAJP for organizing this special joint meeting, and I also would like to express my gratitude for the presentations that have been given today. As the first part of this panel, the results of these summits, we have to underscore that the Democratic Charter perhaps is one of the most important product of the summits process. It was the direct consequence of the democratic cause established in Quebec in 2001, and it continues to be today as the landmark when it comes to dealing with political crises in the Americas. Brazil participated actively in the discussions that led to the approval by acclamation of the Democratic Charter, and views it as important to get back to its original progressive sense. Brazil would like to remember that the mandate given by the heads of government that met in Quebec, and I quote, was to prepare a Inter-American Democratic Charter which reinforces the OAS instruments to actively defend representative democracy, close quotes. So the Inter-American Democratic Charter is one of the most important tools for defending representative democracy. And it was a stimulus, and there was reinforced efforts with this charter. It created new mechanisms, such as the mechanisms provided for in Article 27, and electoral observation mission also helps to enforce the full right to votes and to have fair, free, and transparent elections, and to improve electoral institutions. We also have to underscore that in the midst of the pandemic, with the Department of Electoral Observation and Support, there's been missions in 2020 and 21 to our country. Brazil also supports political missions of the OAS as an instrument to strengthen and preserve the democratic institutional framework. As those, and also not only electoral but political observations are when there's an invitation by the states that are concerned themselves, and there's an expectation that recommendations will be heeded in good faith. this charter is a fundamental part of the pillar of an OAS democracy, and it holds up all the other pillars. Without democracy, there can't be integral development, safe security, or protection of human rights. So, Chair, the second part of the title of this panel is the road to the new summit. And different analysts have on principles and democratic values have been the targets of attack. And this is especially important that we're holding this at this time because it's very timely that these specialists that are going to be speaking in this, in the context of the Democratic Journal, we should, it should be held up again as a conceptual document to vis-a-vis the old and more recent threats to representative democracy in the region. Brazil hopes that the upcoming Summit of the Americans, with the U.S. chairing it, will be a time for collective reflection for this and other challenges of the hemisphere and the benefit of the peoples of the Americas, and to strengthen the inter-American system and its fundamental pillars. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moreira. The chair would like to recognize, acknowledging that we are just a few minutes past the deadline to finish this particular panel. We would like to the chair would like to recognize the alternative representative of Colombia. So you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Chair. The American hemisphere is living a critical time. Not only the pandemic is what's confronted by governments, there's a lot of economic challenges, health ones and social ones as well. And these all go back to before the pandemic. And in the framework of the 2018 summit, they were dealt with. They were addressed, and the situation of Venezuela is creating the greatest exodus of ever, but it also shows an unprecedented collapse of the institutions and the serious problem of corruption that threatens institutions, and the response of which there must be a clear roadmap to remedy this. More than criticisms, the summit should talk about how this process and the OAS should address current threats. A good point of departure to answer this question is the Inter-American Democratic Charter. It, as the zenith of a regional consensus and a commitment to maintain and strengthen democracy, it has proven to be an effective instrument in sustaining stability throughout the hemisphere. And democracy is not understood in a limited way, not just about elections, but also it includes a broad exercise of respectfully governing and human rights and an upright and consensus-based form of government. And it's worthwhile, therefore, to pose the question about the tools in the Democratic Charter to protect democracy, as well the use thereof. Chapter 4 of the Inter-American Democratic Charter puts forward mechanisms of sanction and criticism when there's a deterioration. In the first 10 years of its existence, it was used 10 times. For 7, preventively. Based on these experiences, it's possible to realize that there are occasions when the mechanism was effective and it had a positive impact. Nonetheless, it also shows its constraints. In those cases where it requires greater emphasis on prevention through the use of the Chapter 4 instruments, firstly, strengthen observation missions of Chapter 18 and 17, and to create dialogue spaces in critical moments, as well as diplomatic efforts under Article 20, which is granted to the Permanent Council. Chair, it's obvious that how important how much we need the Inter-American Democratic Charter in the hemisphere at this time, not only as a roadmap of the principles that enable the region to keep democratic regimes in place and broad democratic governance, but also with it because of the tools it provides. This leads to the fact that the Democratic Charter is nothing more than an extension of the foundational charter, the OAS, to which the member states have committed. And Articles 26 and 27 of the Democratic Charter states that democratic culture is a pattern to be, a standard to be promoted under a consensus. Under these principles, it's a key actor so that mandates are complied with. Lastly, we would like to point out how, even with the financial difficulties of the organization, it's pressing to strengthen consensus on the need to provide greater resources and support throughout the hemisphere, such as through MESICIG, the electronic government in Latin America, and the Inter-American program for governments and other programs. Under Article 4, the fundamental components of the exercise of democracy, transparency, probity, responsibility, and public management. Likewise, it is essential to ensure adequate financing for the electoral observation missions, which help states under Article 3 to fulfill their commitments. Lastly, it's necessary to create synergies vis-a-vis the regional leadership of other forums using democratic tactics, promoting them to achieve a regional consensus against the contemporary risks. Thank you very much.
The chair thanks the delegation of Colombia, Mr. Paredes, for those words. I'm seeing no other requests for the floor. The chair expresses its appreciation to those delegations who made interventions on this panel and takes note of them with the support of the Secretariat. I again would like to thank the panelists for joining us today and sharing their views and recommendations with us. As the United States prepares to host the 9th Summit, our region is facing incredible challenges. It is essential that we work together to renew our shared commitment to democracy and human rights in our hemisphere. Our second panel today is a thematic discussion on strengthening democratic resilience in today's hemisphere, which will consist of presentations by 5 experts. The chair of the CAJP, Ambassador Jose Fiallo, permanent representative of the Dominican Republic, will be the moderator. Ambassador, I apologize for giving you the floor 15 minutes later than I should have, but please, over to you, sir. You have the floor.
Thank you, Brad.
Thank you very much for giving me the floor and allow me to co-chair this important meeting with you, together with you, as was just pointed out a second ago, as the chair of the Committee on Juridical and Political Affairs. So I'm going to begin this second special session, the second panel, on strengthening democracy resilience in today's hemisphere. For this purpose, we're going to begin with a presentation of invited experts. They will have a maximum of 7 minutes each. To begin, I'm pleased to welcome to this session and give the floor to Mr. Francisco Guerrero Aguirre, who's the Secretary for Strengthening Democracy of the OAS. Mr. Secretary Herrero, you have the floor at this time. Thank you very much, Ambassador Fiallo. It's a pleasure to greet Ambassador Frendo and Ernesto Mendez and Assistant Secretary General Luis Almagro, Secretary General, all of the ambassadors and all my friends from the different mechanisms that are part of the Inter-American Democratic Charter, and Laura Chinchilla, especially in Diego Garcia Sayan. So over the contemporary history, there's been such complex challenges. There's never been such complex challenges as those that we have now. The impact of COVID-19 has unprecedented over the course of the recent history. The emergence of this health crisis has not only tested or uncovered our weaknesses, but the OAS, as the principal political forum of the hemisphere, has had to adapt to the new challenges caused by the pandemic. We're convinced that only democracy can ensure a long-term recovery and at the same time strengthen an institution, ensuring protection of the rights of citizens of the region. Therefore, in this regard, and it has been stated repeatedly, the Secretary General Luis Almagro, it's necessary to get back to practices and to use the creativity to fulfill the mandate of broadening the institutional mandate and to strengthen the mechanisms contained in the Inter-American Democratic Charter. There's Secretary General Don Luis Almagro was very clear at the beginning of the pandemic. The instruction we received in the Secretariat for Strengthening Democracy is that the observation missions, electoral observation missions, should continue independently of the pandemic. So last year, the first mission went out since the pandemic began to follow up on the general elections in Suriname. In 2020, a total of 11 electoral observation missions were deployed, and 6 were in the midst of the pandemic itself. So far this year of 2021, and just despite the complex scenario caused by the health crisis, there's been 5 electoral observation missions: El Salvador, Ecuador, Bolivia, Honduras, and Peru thus far this year. I'd like to take advantage of this opportunity to thank you for the fundamental contribution of Canada and other member states who have been continued to finance these processes, and also say that in the context of the upcoming summit, as the representative of Colombia has said, it can be established clearly that the summit ratify its commitment to electoral observation, particularly through funding that's absolutely essential at these difficult times that's being experienced by our democracies. On June 6th, there'll be 2 observation missions at the same time will be deployed. The one for the second round of presidential elections in Peru and then general elections in Mexico. The director of the Department of Cooperation of Observation Election and myself will be in Peru. Can't take part in Mexico, which is our country of origin, will be in Peru. And this is to preserve neutrality and objectivity of observation missions. It's important to underscore that during this period, the OAS has developed important instruments and has a hybrid method of virtual meetings with different stakeholders involved in elections, as well as visits, in-person visits and meetings on the ground. The success of this methodology has been because we've taken strict precautions, including personal protective equipment, social distancing, and biosecurity protocols we follow at all meetings that were in person. And along these same lines, the guidelines to organize these meetings during the pandemic, I believe that it's been an important contribution for electoral officials and other members of the state, can ensure the right of the city, sovereign right to ensure safe vote and have a proper electoral contest that is transparent and safe and fair. In this health crisis, we've seen the commitment of citizens to in going to the polls. And this economic crisis triggered by the COVID, this is quite impressive. The structural problems of democracy, of course, continue present in our region. However, the elections continue to be held and people continue to vote. Somehow, the pandemic has showed us that democracy was sufficiently rooted in the public conscience. And so even though there's been some elections that have to be rescheduled, overall, we've seen resiliency and resistance to adapt quickly to these challenges and ensure for citizens their right to choose and be chosen. And we also approved another document which is available to everybody who's joined us. And this, it says, the Inter-American Democratic Charter, a political action guide to confront COVID-19 pandemic. This document, of course, it's a document that's very useful in the midst of these circumstances. We've also continued to work on promoting peace and links with legislative and legislatures and the area between Belize and Guatemala, the peace missions, and El Salvador, for example, as well. Allow me at this time to wrap up, because time is of the essence, is that to say that the health crisis has exposed the need for those who govern to prioritize universal access to health, recovery of jobs, and new sources of normal income. The only way to keep people alive is through democracy, elections, and from at the OAS, we underscore our commitment for the operation missions will continue as provided by the Charter, will continue forward, and we thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much, Secretary Guerrero, for your presentation. Let us continue with the next invited guest. I'm pleased welcome and give the floor right now to this meeting, Laura Chinchilla, former President of Costa Rica. I've lost my internet. Take over.
Estamos, ahora sí. Muchas gracias, señor presidente Fiallo, señor embajador Freden, secretario general Luis Almagro, secretario adjunto, secretario de Asuntos Políticos Guerrero, Francisco Guerrero, estimables miembros de este panel, señores representantes de la OEA, amigas y amigos. Agradezco muchísimo la
Thank you very much for this invitation to be part of this special meeting as we commemorate the 20th anniversary of the Democratic Charter, the Inter-American Democratic Charter, which was signed by the countries of our region who, through it, committed to protecting democracy. This was done with the enactment of the Charter in 2001, and 2 decades later, after a couple of these countries started to transition towards democracy, that in and of itself is a major achievement. In the world, there has not been a similar situation where an entire region has so quickly and so decisively embraced this sort of a transition, and where democracy has shown to be so resilient to economic crises and also differences in geopolitical shifts. Since then, there have been a number of considerable changes in democracy in the region, and unfortunately, not all of them have been for the better. In the positive changes column, we can talk about the regular holding of elections to elect officials and increasing women's participation and representation, still not where it needs to be, but going forward, and also the increased protection of rights. Also, the malaise with democracy has also been increasing, which needs to be highlighted. And that sort of disenchantment that we've seen over the last decade has gone hand in hand with the gradual deterioration of a number of different democratic issues, like the freedom of speech and judicial independence, the separation of powers and transparency in combating organized crime, impunity, and corruption. That is the conclusion that a number of different organizations have come to through their analyses, including the OAS. There is an increase in the number of steps that are taken, not necessarily to find ourselves all of a sudden in an autocratic government overnight, but waking up to the deterioration of democracy and democratic principles. The different political agreements that can allow for addressing the institutional challenges and socioeconomic and environmental challenges before us is one of the steps that is necessary. The crisis that we see now has come from the COVID-19 pandemic, but is also a situation that speaks for itself and highlights all of these topics. We need to recognize, first of all, that not all of the OAS's instruments can really address the current threats that are facing our democracies today. Secondly, that the instruments that could perhaps be fit to address these challenges, as we can find in the Democratic Charter, are not being enforced as urgently or as timely as necessary for the circumstances. Now, in terms of my first concern, I should say that the threats to democracy not only come from the nature that has been taken into account in the Washington Protocol, which was an amendment to the OAS Charter in 1997, and which gave the organization the right to suspend a member country whose democratically elected country is ousted by force. We saw this in 2 countries in the region and members of the organization, and what has happened over the last 2 decades, where there was a gradual deterioration of its institutions that was being advanced by the very governments in power, and through steps that were not legal or legitimate. There's the case of one country that has not had elementary elections in 2019, and other countries where there is an open attack against judicial independence, which is one of the main pillars of the rule of law. Ladies and gentlemen, everything I am discussing now has taken place and is taking place while we have a democratic charter. And so I would like to place 3 ideas on the table, which I believe can help increase and enhance democratic resilience in the region, and to also deliver on the promises of the democratic charter. Some of these, I recognize, were brought up in the previous panel. The first is that without weakening the mechanisms in place to address the sudden cases of democratic collapse, there could be a greater focus given to the slow and gradual deterioration of democracy in the region. Because when we operate on the premise that everything is great until everything isn't going well, means that the OAS is always going to be behind the curve. We need to understand that democracy in the region is imperfect, and therefore standing up for it is a task that requires that we take steps every day. Secondly, just as the OAS has important instruments to protect human rights and for observing and strengthening elections, there should be other specific and targeted instruments designed to increase the robustness of the rule of law and to strengthen democracy. For example, there can be a task force set up to look at the rule of law in the region. Can be made up of experienced diplomats and political experts who can get full support from the Permanent Council so that their work can turn into tangible and concrete steps. It would also be wise to think about creating or strengthening the existing mechanisms for monitoring and providing technical assistance, including the creation of a new Office of Rapporteur to provide a deeper cooperation between other special rapporteurships and organizations. Finally, I'd be remiss if I didn't take this opportunity to also appeal to the conscience and the will that should come out of the political sphere itself. Valuable instruments like the Democratic Charter and the efforts of this organization will all fall short in preventing democratic collapse in the region if the collegial bodies and political bodies do not take steps in a timely fashion and take into account the technical recommendations issued without the necessary political actions. In the end, if these things aren't taken into account, democracy pays a price in a region that should instead be seeing increased dialogue and cooperation. And there will also be an increase in threats to our democracy because just like they do not distinguish between political parties, we should not take a too narrow approach at addressing it. The Democratic Charter, we must also understand, does not reflect our reality, but rather our aspirations. In order to continue moving forward with those aspirations, the entire region requires ongoing supervision and technical support, as well as a political and joint action from the main bodies of the OAS to protect it. Thank you.
Chinchilla, muchas gracias por tu presentación.
Thank you very much, President Chinchilla, for that presentation. We certainly look forward to hearing from you again as we bring this event to a close. We are going to now move to our next guest. I am pleased to welcome this session Kevin Casas Zamora, who is a Secretary General of International IDEA, non-resident senior fellow of the Peter D. Bell Rule of Law program at the Inter-American Dialogue. You have the floor, sir. Can you hear me now? I'm not sure if you can see me, though. Let's see. This is strange. Can you see me now? It's bizarre. Well, according to what I'm seeing here, my camera is on. Can you check, says the tech, if you have another app using that camera? There's nothing else open, says the speaker. Very, very strange. The interpreter highlights the technician is trying to address the glitch.
Dice ahí que está apagada.
Ok, fíjese sobre la derecha que dice cámara arriba y selecciona a ver si tiene seleccionada la cámara o alguna otra cámara
No,
que le
no me
aparezca
da
que pueda
ninguna
seleccionar.
opción para abrir. Mire, no sé qué hacer realmente. No sé qué hacer. Porque
Yo creo que
once again, the interpreter highlights that the technician was trying to assist. The chair comes back in. If there is no issue with everyone else, perhaps we can just go with the audio.
Señor Casas Zamora, si puede solicitar la palabra ahora a ver si se soluciona el problema.
The technician asks Mr. Casas Zamora to once again request the floor. Are you using Chrome, sir? Very well, Chrome may be denying access to the camera, says the technician. The interpreter points out the technician is trying to troubleshoot.
Embajador, adelante Alejandro. Orfiallo, ¿puede por favor continuar con el siguiente panelista?
Very well. We're going to try to resolve the technical issues our guest, Mr. Casas Zamora, is having. In the meantime, let's hear from Miriam Kornblith, who is a Senior Director for Latin America and the Caribbean of the National Endowment for Democracy. You have the floor, ma'am.
Buenas tardes, muchísimas gracias.
Good afternoon, and thank you all very much. Special thanks to the officials, the Secretary General of the OAS. I'd also like to thank the chair of this panel. I'd like to share some thoughts on what I believe are major challenges for the OAS, the Democratic Charter, and the region as a whole can continue to ensure democratic resilience. I first and foremost believe that it's important to understand the context in which the Democratic Charter was adopted, this being the Inter-American Democratic Charter. At that time, there was still a certain amount of optimism having to do with the third democratic wave in the world. And of course, in Latin America, there was optimism regarding this democratic renaissance and opportunities once there was a toppling of the dictatorships that went through the region in the 70s and 80s. So there was an overall feeling of optimism at the end of the Fujimori dictatorship that over 10 years had rattled Peru. That played an important role in boosting the possibility for adoption of this charter. That being said, what happened in Peru, which was having had a popularly elected government through secret and direct voting, was then overthrown by the coup. There were regimes that then were elected democratically, but then used the democratic instruments in order to subvert the very systems that elected them, is the main challenge that I believe we're seeing in the region and throughout the world. But it is something that could not have been fully covered in the Inter-American Democratic Charter, as has been said by many of those who spoke before me. Now, the Charter is very clear when it comes to what we call the interruption of democratic order, but has a hard time finding a way to address the systematic and a gradual attempt to subvert democratic order, which is what has happened from democratically elected governments. Now, it's important to understand, too, that unlike that time, right now, globally, we are seeing democratic backsliding. That is what is happening in Latin America as well, and it suffices to look at the latest report from Freedom House. Freedom House reports on the systematic democratic backsliding around the world over the last 15 years, where the gap between the countries reporting democratic progress compared to those reporting democratic deterioration has increased to the point where, according to this report, right now in 45 countries throughout the world, there were reports of democratic deterioration and very few countries with actual progress. Unfortunately, that is what is happening in Latin America as well. And just to highlight some of the more obvious cases in the region, we have 3 dictatorships. We have Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, which are also part of the worst dictatorships in the world. 60 years of dictatorship in Cuba, 20 years in Venezuela, and let's hope that that is a shorter time period in Nicaragua. But there's a lot to be concerned about. We see that optimism around democracy right now is being clouded not only in Latin America, but also throughout the world. In terms of the Inter-American Democratic Charter, I think it's important to look at it by taking into account what the specific modern threats are to democracy. And perhaps talk about what the inherent limitations are to the Charter, which are natural limitations because this document came to be 20 years ago. I think that first and foremost is important to highlight what other panelists and experts, not only here today, but also at different times, have brought up, which is the very government and state-centered nature of the Charter. Now, it makes sense because this is an organization that represents countries in the region, but given what we're currently seeing, states and governments are the main perpetrators of the threats to democracy and the main perpetrators of violations of human rights. And so it's important to shift that central focus and think about the different players and voices and how to open up these spaces at the OAS. The OAS has made great strides in including civil society. This is something that needs to be strengthened and something that needs to continue in order to continue to grow the chorus of voices that needs to be heard, so that there can be better coordination as well between those voices and the different state actors in order to bring all of that together. The second aspect has to do with an alteration of the constitutional order. Just recently, what was said was that it was impossible to define what alteration of democratic order meant, that the Charter wasn't specific enough. And what I think was done recently in terms of what was done in Venezuela and how to define it, how to use the instruments of the OAS in order to address that issue, that needs to be systematized and institutionalized. And I think that that is the most recent example of a systematic and democratic approach, taking into account what we understand as the alteration of democratic order. The interpretation of that was very modern, very creative in order to address a situation where there was an alteration of the democratic order, which is exactly what we saw also thanks to the spearheaded effort by the Secretary General. And once again, that needs to be systematized and institutionalized. Third, we have electoral observation missions, or EOMs. Obviously, this is a key topic. The OAS has played a leading role in that regard, but at the same time, we must recognize that these authoritarian governments use elections in order to subvert democracy. And at the same time, these authoritarian governments refuse to accept any role played by EOMs, and I believe that the OAS should find more creative ways and think outside the box in order to address that one specific issue, the use of elections by autocratic governments in order to subvert democracy, and also address what happens in a situation where a government refuses to let an EOM in. Now, lastly, we have COVID. The OAS has put out great instruments, great documents, I should say. And I believe that the OAS should continue moving forward in order to continue to become a very active leader in coordinating efforts in the region to address COVID. As everyone has already highlighted, the hemisphere has been particularly hard hit by COVID, and the aftermath can be absolutely ravaging for the region. I believe the OAS can play a very important role as the kind of leader that can bring people together to address this throughout the entire region. Thank you very much, Miriam, for those remarks. Let's see if we have been able to address the technical issues that Kevin Casas Zamora was having. Mr. Chairman, can you hear me? Seems that the camera is no longer working. Well, if that works for you, says the chair, we can continue with just the audio. Great, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. My apologies for what is happening. I'm not sure exactly what has happened to the camera. That being said, it is a pleasure to be here, having accepted the invitation from the Summit Secretariat and the Permanent Council. This conversation is happening at a very timely moment. Latin America, and a little bit further north as well, is going through an extraordinarily challenging political time. The interpreter highlights there is some interference. Yes, excuse me. Please go ahead, says the chair. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Once again, Latin America is experiencing an extraordinarily challenging political time where democratic governance is being threatened in a number of countries, and there is a move towards authoritarianism in a number of different countries. If we want to protect the progress we've seen in democracy in Latin America, which has been great, and if there's an interest in preserving the legacy of the Inter-American Democratic Charter as well, my suggestion is that we focus on three aspects. The first is preserving the ability of the Americas to hold elections during the pandemic. This year alone, in what is left of it, we're going to see 5 presidential elections in Latin America and 2 legislative elections that are going to be key in Mexico and Argentina. In addition to this, there's going to be the constitutional referendum in Chile, and there are going to be a lot of elections happening. The major achievement of democratic transition in Latin America was to turn elections into the only way to get to power, which was an absolutely monumental transformation in Latin America. Latin America holds elections, and for the most part, they go well, which is particularly important at this time because elections in many cases are the only escape valve for political systems that are so stressed as we're seeing right now. And so we need to help countries hold these elections in a credible way. We hope that out of this pandemic, we can see an agenda be born that focuses on election reform that can help Latin America come up with different methods to ensure that there is security around voting. And of course, through these different methods, we're thinking about having longer election days, vote by mail, and others. Having electronic voting allowed as well. So we need to protect the credibility of election officials. But the good news is that the Inter-American system has an extremely powerful instrument to do this, and that is the Department for Electoral Observation and Cooperation at the OAS. That's the DECO. That has already been said here, and it is important to provide it with all of the support necessary, be it financial, be it political, to ensure that the DECO can continue to do the fantastic work it does. The second crucial aspect is ensuring that democratic governance is at the heart of all policies. If there's something to learn from this pandemic, it is that the government's ability is one of the key aspects to address crises. Now, we can perhaps advocate for democracy in terms of the democratic values, but ultimately 90% of people are only interested in seeing the problem solved, particularly in a time of crisis. Giving governments the capacity they need to solve issues for their societies is key. And this means that we need to fully embrace an agenda that takes on a number of different issues, like the design of its institutions. For example, the toxic combination of presidential efforts and some of the instruments that are allowed for subverting these things. This is becoming a huge problem in Latin America, and this is making it harder to meet the needs of the people. As long as there is no ability to effectively solve these issues and to make decisions effectively so that problems can actually be solved and people feel like their problems are solved, as long as that is not in place, then people are going to go with anyone who is singing a song they like. If we don't address these issues, what we're going to see in the region is exactly what we're seeing. These fluctuations between the different presidents who are incredibly weak and can't get anything done, and on the other end, having these hyper presidents, presidents who take over the entire institution of the country and who use it at their will. In addition to this, institutional design is something that we need to think about when we think about the state's abilities. We need to create an agenda that can also foster more fiscal robustness in Latin America, one that can also focus on the quality of government services, and also one that focuses on strengthening efforts in order to once again instill trust in people and their institutions. If we want to get that trust back, it is key to also discuss the urgency of addressing the corruption pandemic, which is continuing to gut confidence that people once had in their institutions. Designing these different practices is something that multilateral organizations can do very well. For example, we have the MESI-SIC, the mechanism of monitoring and follow-up on corruption, the MESI-HED, the Inter-American mechanism for public administration, and the HEAL, and these other mechanisms. They need to get support and the necessary resources to continue their work. The third aspect that I believe is absolutely key for democratic resilience is the issue of protecting judicial independence. The major pending task in Latin America is addressing the weak rule of law. There's corruption, there's lack of access to justice, there's the issue of very weak checks and balances. And all of this has an impact ultimately on the rule of law. Now, the older I get, the more convinced I become that judicial independence is the true bellwether of the health and solidity of a democracy. And what we need to understand is that anyone who says that they have been able to root out corruption lose all credibility when the first thing they do is weaken judicial independence. And we cannot forget what has been said, which is that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And what's even more important is to understand that judicial independence shows how important a society believes democracy is and how these powers need to be separate within the system. And so this is why what is happening in El Salvador is so serious. And there is no coincidence in seeing that all of these authoritarian regimes start with an attack on the judicial system and the press. We've seen that in the Philippines, we've seen it in Turkey, we've seen it in other countries. Protecting judicial independence is imperative absolutely now as well, because the emergency powers that have been invoked by governments during the pandemic is what is at stake. If there is not a robust constitutional check on these powers, this can become the new normal, and not only in Latin America. The same way that the OAS can help countries in the hemisphere to hold credible elections and robust election officials, it is important to also allow the CAJP to continue to build a robust agenda in order to protect judicial independence. The Inter-American system, the next summit, must protect credibility of elections during the pandemic, because if not, having a robust reform agenda in order to improve democratic institutions and build capacity for countries, and also to truly defend the independence of justice, I believe that our democracies will unfortunately be working incessantly on protecting something that will eventually still come. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your presentation. Our next and last invited I welcome to this session and give the floor to Dr. Diego Garcia Sayan, who's a member of the Friends of the Inter-American Democratic Charter, former president of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, and UN Special Rapporteur on the Independence of Judges and Lawyers. In addition, as Foreign Minister of Peru in 2001, he proposed the initiative in the first text of the Inter-American Democratic Charter. Dr. Garcia, you have the floor. Thank you, Ambassador Fiallo. It's a pleasure to join you all here today, this afternoon. I am going to refrain from greeting each one of the hierarchy because in the interest of time. But I agreed everyone. About 20 years ago, Peru was trying to reconstruct its democratic system through political dialogue around a table that was promoted by the OAS. It had achieved in black and white all of the plans that had to be put into operation by the government of Fujimori in its last months or weeks. That dialogue committee was absolutely important for a peaceful transition to a democracy. It started at the end of 2001, and I was honored to coincide in the government with Javier Pérez de Cuellar, which was just mentioned a few minutes ago. It was based on that experience to have, after faced a coup which had emerged from within, an democratic elected president had spearheaded it, and so it was proposed 20 years ago in the summit of Quebec in record time to negotiate this text, which was approved by consensus at the OAS, which was remembered in September of that same year. So the concrete contribution is viewing it as a procedure that was so important and which became part of the language of the content of the Democratic Charter. Over the years, many ideas and suggestions have come up for the next summit, take them into account. I join into that. I endorse that. But if I take stock, there's been good things and bad things. There are circumstances, as others have mentioned, that the Democratic Charter should have been used when it wasn't, and countries that assault their national, others would say there's national sovereignty when they're criticized, and then it's applied. It's not a tool of sanction, but to solve political crises is what the Democratic Charter actually is. So what's also been noted today is that we have a very special crisis, a health crisis that's been mentioned so many times today, in which even though our region only has 8% of the world's population, 30% of the persons who have died from the pandemic are from Latin America. And then also there's been huge impacts on the political dynamics and a type of polarizing process in the social arena and social protests, also in elections. Step by step, there is questioning of democratic values and principles. And what's at stake is judicial independence and interference of different types. Sometimes they're veiled, sometimes they're thwarted, or sometimes, I remember in the prior person who spoke it, there's a lack of a political decision with regard to due process and with regard to removability of judges, tenure of judges, and designating those who would take over those who come into the judiciary. Something like that just happened on May 1st in El Salvador, I'm referring to. So after 20 years, we, among the good points and bad parts of the charter, once again, many ideas have come up to improve early warning systems, preventive actions in light of deterioration of democratic processes. These are aspects that are of the utmost importance, and judicial independence, which we've pointed out how important that is. But beyond that, it's my area, because this is a subject that it causes enough alarm to me, particularly in questioning the legitimacy of a democratic process in a particular country. So the major questions that should be posed will require that the next summit reaffirms the principles of democracy, to reaffirm the standards of the Inter-American Democratic Charter. But after 20 years, with a limited effective efforts that there have been to apply the charter in circumstances when it should have been, but there was promotion of democracy. But there's got to be clear that the application of the charter is not a sanctioning mechanism. It's sort of the lobby. It doesn't exist in the OAS charter. What's in that? For example, in that, such as like in the UN Security Council, it's not like that. But the political commitments that are reaffirmed at the next summit, it's very important that among this, that there's a careful analysis and examination of each of the serious political crises to see whether the charter can be applied or not. And this is the responsibility of the member states. This is the responsibility of the Secretariat as well, of the General Secretary. Without prejudice to that, notwithstanding, I think it would be a good idea that I was sort of thinking about over a long time, and it just emerged in the group of friends at the Carter Center a few years ago, the idea of establishing a mechanism that we could call of a rapporteurship. It could be an individual one, it could be a collegial body appointed by the Permanent Council or by the General Secretariat or the Secretary General. Independent individuals who can advise and put into motion initiatives of the Permanent Council that has so many different tasks it is engaged in. And so this independent and neutral entity could be a very important element to facilitate certain steps and actions and certain pedagogy, teaching. It's necessary to stimulate this at this time so it's not viewed automatically as a sanction. Today in Europe, there's discussion on Poland and Hungary. They're claiming that there's interference in national sovereignty, is what they say there. So my congratulations to all the states that made it possible that in 2001, the Democratic Charter was signed by them on that complex, difficult, painful day of September 11th, 2001. And it provides hope to me that the next steps will be to reaffirm these principles so that every time there's a true threat, whenever we have to take steps against democratic institutions, there's a capacity to react immediately. Thank you very much, Ambassador, and I'd like to thank each and every one of you who take part at this important meeting. Good afternoon. Dr. Garcia Sayan, thank you very much for your presentation, and we conclude here with the space for the presentation of our invited experts to this panel. And we shall take proper note of all of this. Next, we have a 45-minute space for any member states would like to discuss with this panel strengthening of democratic resilience in today's hemisphere. We should finish at 5:45, please. So allow me to offer the floor to any delegation who would like to take part in this discussion at this time. The ambassador of Guatemala, Scioli, has the floor at this time. Thank you, Chair. My delegation congratulates the chair of the summit of CISC and the Commission on Political and Juridical Affairs for this important meeting that's divided into two segments. I salute Doña Laura Chinchilla, former president of Costa Rica, the distinguished experts, and I thank you for your invaluable presentations that you've made today by persons who are definitely committed to developing democracy and the Inter-American Democratic Charter. In the framework of the commitment of the organization to the four thematic pillars, we must underscore that the OAS has been a leader and pioneer in protecting and defending democracy. In its foundational document, it contemplates the promotion and consolidation of democracy, representative democracy, as an essential purpose of the organization. And thus, the OAS has taken on a fundamental role in defending democracy in the hemisphere, advocating for transparency in governance through access to information, freedom of communication means, the media, and decision-making process, and promotion of human rights. As a result of the needs that social and historical evolution have showed, the General Assembly approved in 2001 the Inter-American Democratic Charter, whereby the American states recognize the rights of their people to democracy, as well to the duty of governments to promote and defend it. The Inter-American Democratic Charter is an instrument at the service of preventing conflicts and promoting solidarity to prevent any type of conflict or crisis, and strengthening and preserving representative institutions, as has been noted today. This mechanism is operative through the Article 4, which endows governments and the General Secretariat with important powers in case of risks of democratic stability and exercise of power. On the 20th anniversary of the Inter-American Democratic Charter, Guatemala underscores its preventive nature and its permanent validity, because its mere existence calls on fulfilling the obligations that were freely and previously agreed upon by the American states. The delegation of Guatemala takes advantage of this opportunity to recognize the importance of the report of 2011, which was approved by the Permanent Council in a process of 2010-2011, the reflection process, to beef up the capacity of the mechanisms and preventive actions of the OAS. And I point out, among others, the role of these instruments and mechanisms of the OAS to support countries in their efforts to strengthen democratic institutions and support a more dynamic, proactive, and flexible role of the Secretary General in this regard. Chair, representative democracy requires to fully exist not only decisions taken by a majority, that people elect representatives in the different government bodies and grant sufficient power to them to be able to make decisions and to the in benefit of everyone. So it was once identified as an essential element of democracy that citizens should be proposed alternative realities to elect their representatives, as well as create the adequate conditions to elect between different options. My delegation underscores the importance of strengthening democracy, and an effort that since 1962 has been done by the electoral observation missions have been doing in my country, and the guarantee that their participation represents in holding periodic and fair and free elections in our country. Recognize this effort, which didn't stop during the pandemic, that it could have done, as Secretary Guerrero had pointed out. We consider it that that this mission be funded to be able to continue working and to implement the recommendations that are issued by these missions. To conclude, my country is convinced that respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms and access to governance and exercise of power and rule of law and holding free elections are essential for social, political, and economic development in the Americas. Guatemala reiterates its commitment to contribute to the building of a democratically strengthened region and engaging in dialogue to express the leadership, express recognition of the leadership of the OAS to maintain democracy and governance, good governance in the region. In this context, I'd like to say that it's the sovereign decision of nations to resort in preventively to the democratic chart, Inter-American Democratic Chart. My country trusts that in working jointly with the OAS, it will strengthen national efforts on behalf of dialogue, transparency against corruption and impunity, defense of human rights, and strengthening of institution and rule of law. The OAS plays a coordinating leadership role with initiatives to combat COVID-19. I believe that this is, no question, a very important note for the OAS continues in these times of crisis. Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you, Ambassador of Guatemala, for your remarks. Now the Chair recognizes the Ambassador of the Dominican Republic, Ana Beltrán. Thank you very much, Chair. The delegation of the Dominican Republic would like to thank the speakers for their remarks on at these panels. It's so relevant that we're on the 20th anniversary of the approval of the Inter-American Democratic Charter by acclamation. Likewise, we would like to underscore the leadership of the delegation of the United States in its capacity as the chair for the 9th summit and the efforts it's done in coordinating this event. I also join into the words to recognize the delegation of Panama for having parity in the panelists on both sessions today. Since last year, the countries of the region, as well as the rest of the world, have been significantly impacted by the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic. This crisis has exposed hidden weaknesses and vulnerabilities beyond social and economic areas. It's showed the extreme situation of the most vulnerable situations: migrants, women, LGBTI community, and populations that have been particularly impacted by racism during this crisis period. In our region, as well as in other parts of the world, we've addressed the challenges in this pandemic through implementation of measures and policies to mitigate the effects thereof. With regard to the health crisis, this crisis has required a significant effort by all of our states to provide an immediate response that's sufficient and adequate while adapting us and adjusting to this new reality that's still evolving. Our countries have always also been impacted by necessary measures of lockdown to combat the pandemic. Most states, we've imposed quarantines and we've imposed states of emergency, ensuring access to basic needs and assuming and taking on the cost thereof through external financing mostly. In our particular case, we've implemented strategies to combat the epidemic forcefully. In our country, we have a plan to meet the immediate needs with regard to health and other different sectors that are directly impacted by the crisis. The Dominican Republic has made great efforts in implementing a national vaccination plan to try. In 2021, we would like to vaccinate 8 million people. For this purpose, the government has been working tirelessly to try to take the measures necessary to obtain these vaccines. The government of the Dominican Republic has made transparency one of the central elements of its effort at management of this crisis. At the same time, the national vaccination plan, there's important health measures that have been taken. There's social programs for the most vulnerable segments of the population. Likewise, there's been efforts made with regard to the resilience with small, medium, micro companies in productive areas such as agriculture, tourism, to be able to maintain the economy on afloat. And the president has called on the different ministers of economy from different countries and for May 24th in Santo Domingo to discuss the current situation and identify economic and financial solutions that are viable for our countries. The global nature of the challenge from the COVID-19 pandemic requires cooperation of all actors in order to protect our populations. It is in this framework of regional and multilateral cooperation that the OAS has become the major forum in the region with a capacity to bring together all of the states, civil society, private sector, workers, and academicians. With no question, the OAS plays a determinant role in seeking solutions to combat effectively and efficiently COVID-19 in the region. Through effective communication between actors, periodic reports, oversight, and coordination of actions of the organization, we can facilitate gathering in the necessary indicators and analysis thereof so that firm actions can be taken to counter the effects of the pandemic. We consider that it's vitally important to continue to strengthen and promote the different mechanisms of participation in political and social deliberation. In the current context of the Inter-American Democratic Charter is even more important as an instrument whose values and mechanisms allows identification of adequate responses to emergency situations. In this regard, the frame of reference provided by the charter is important to strengthen institutions and governance. These are essential elements to move forward vis-a-vis these challenges of the pandemic, particularly in this new phase of economic recovery and progressive reestablishment of society. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dominican Republic delegation. I give the floor right now to Don Gustavo Carre of Venezuela. Thank you very much, Josue. I'd like to begin by saying that the two subjects for this panels are overlap in a certain way, both for the upcoming summit as well as the 20-year celebration of the charter. It's obvious there cannot be a summit of the member countries of this organization without discussing the issue of democracy, the issue of the deterioration of democracy, and threats against democracy. And therefore, I congratulate the chair of the committee, the OAS committee that's been engaged in studying or preparing this summit, the ambassador for the United States and Ambassador Lambert as well, for the work done in preparing for the summit. Now, however, we've heard many remarks that I can't let go by without saying that I concur with everything every single one of them said. The Democratic Charter sets forth essential principles for democracy to exist. And there's unanimous agreement on that score. So if we look at our continents, when someone jumps the barrier, goes beyond the Democratic Charter, that's the problem. So someone could think that in Venezuela, and I look at Article 3 of the Democratic Charter, that respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms. Somebody might think that access to power and its exercise are done under rule of law. and that periodic, free, fair elections with universal and direct voting are conducted. So one would think that Venezuela is a pluralistic system with different parties and that there's independent branches of government. So, but in Venezuela that doesn't exist. And there's no consensus in Venezuela to condemn this. We have no consensus to unequivocally condemn what's going on, what's happening in the country. Nor in Nicaragua is there a consensus to condemn this. It's just huge assault on democracy in these countries and in the continent as a result of this. There's been analysis, examination, and proposals. They're all very interesting in linking the problem of democracy to the to corruption, linking democracy and corruption to the pandemic, and how the pandemic has concentrated power and has led to abuses by many regimes throughout the hemisphere who are trying to reinforce the concentration of power. This is all something that's a common thread in all of the comments that were made today, because the Democratic Charter analyzes we've analyzed the problems in the hemisphere through the Democratic Charter, and this is what we've come up with now. Unfortunately, this doesn't go beyond this consensus that we have all come to under the guise of respecting sovereignty or whatever it is. It's been, some of the speakers have brought it up, but many countries would rather just sort of look the other way. But in private, even though we all know that the situation of Venezuela is not a democracy, but unfortunately we're seeing a situation where that Nicolas Maduro's regime is tolerated just all the same. I believe it's highly important that this issue of democracy be examined without looking at political convenience, or expediency or ideological bias, or without any geopolitical ambition, but respecting the Charter. And this is an examination which I believe has not been done. It should be done country by country, because it's not just Venezuela and Nicaragua. It's in a lot of countries where it's failing democracy. That there's many countries. If you look at the map of Latin America and the rest of the hemisphere, both in the Caribbean as well as in North America, there's democracy, but there's failure as well. Now, the important thing would be to become aware among these two countries, which are so far outside the realm of the dictates of the Democratic Charter, but at least consider this problem without any political bias or any favoritism. And so I would like to congratulate the chair, Laura Chinchilla, President Laura Chinchilla, for her words, and also for having her and all of this on the agenda. And I would like to congratulate all the speakers who have done a fabulous job for this subject we deeply dealt with in depth as it deserves. Thank you very much, Gustavo. And now Doña Alejandra Solana of Costa Rica is recognized at this time. Thank you very much. Distinguished former President Laura Chinchilla, distinguished Kevin Casas, it's a pleasure to have you here with us at this virtual meeting. My warm greetings, co-chairs, Secretary General, Assistant Secretary General, and my colleagues, analysts, etc. Thank you for this important meeting and all the important input you provided. This year, Central America is 200 years of independence is being celebrated in Central America, and the 20th anniversary of the Democratic Charter is being celebrated. Even though we're seeing huge challenges, we have the general widespread COVID-19 health crisis, which has caused so much pain and suffering, but also to overcome the economic crisis caused by it. To emerge from this crisis requires collaboration, and right now multilateralism is extremely important. With regard to the democratic charter, we want to say that the member countries of this organization have recognized principles in our foundational charter, where we recognize democracy as a stabilizing factor of peace and development in the region. That part of the premise is that the effective representative democracy is the rule of law, and that has to be deepened with ongoing participation and involvement of citizens under the law. As the distinguished panelists have said, in the current democracies, there must be resistance to the onslaught that limits certain fundamental freedoms and breakdown in the rule of law. This context, in our countries represented here, we should play a leading role with regard to promoting social dialogue and citizen participation. And so the exercise and discussion of rights such as this meeting are very important, hence. And so we must think about the participation of citizens as a right and a responsibility as well. Our guiding force should be democracy to be more and growing, increasingly resilient, and overcome the economic and health crisis with measures that have a human rights respect approach and respect and strengthening of democratic institutions. The Charter says that democracy is indispensable for exercising fundamental freedoms and human rights in its universal nature, which is indivisible and interdependent. COVID-19 has tested this more than ever. The states of the region, we should be united and use all the instruments that multilateralism provides for us to be capable of provide common and clear and decisive responses that can solutions. Ladies and gentlemen, together we should push forward a inclusive economic recovery. Together we should strengthen our democracies towards more resilient democracies. Only in this way can we renew the commitment of not leaving anyone behind, where each and every one of the citizens of our region can view the future with hope. It's our commitment, and we should honor it. Thank you very much.
Tiene ahora la palabra.
Thank you. We now offer the floor to the United States.
Thank you very much, Chair. I would like to begin by thanking the panelists for their powerful presentations. I am able to state without any hesitation that the United States will continue to advance efforts to strengthen the OAS's role in promoting and defending the right to democracy as reflected in the Democratic Charter. Implementing the Charter remains a multilateral priority for the United States. Working together in a transparent manner and with political will, we must continue to act under the Democratic Charter to strengthen democratic institutions and ensure that the benefits of democracy are tangible for all sectors of our hemisphere's population, particularly the poor and marginalized. As with most visionary ideas, implementation requires resolve, hard work, and strategic clarity. Implementation of the Charter requires respect for constitutional order and legal frameworks, respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms, respect for the pluralistic societies that we live in, respect for the rule of law, and respect for the separation of powers and the independence of the branches of government, including the judiciary, and respect for all democratic institutions. Through the Democratic Charter, government officials are called to build a hemisphere based on liberty and social justice. and to create the conditions in which all of our citizens can realize their democratic aspirations. We are all committed in the Democratic Charter, and I quote, the peoples of the Americas have a right to democracy, and their governments have an obligation to promote and defend it, unquote. That means that it is critical that we speak out for those who strive for a voice in their governments. And when we do, it should not be against any particular individual or party, but in favor of these common ideals and institutions designed to defend and promote them. Our landmark charter emphasizes the essential link between democracy and social and economic development. It would be hard to imagine this common cause without acknowledging the democratic growth that has transformed most countries in the Americas. Over the past 2 decades, the OAS has played a critical role in brokering the peaceful settlement of border disputes and in facilitating free and fair elections through its expert electoral observation missions. Unfortunately, our region's successes do not tell the whole story. Our progress together is unmistakable, but it is also incomplete and uneven. In fact, we have seen backsliding in our hemisphere in upholding the principles of the Democratic Charter. Nowhere is this more visible today than in Nicaragua and Venezuela. Unfortunately, it is also becoming a cause for increasing concern in Haiti and El Salvador. We therefore welcome ongoing engagement by the Permanent Council and regional leaders regarding the situations in these countries. We continue to support the OAS playing a constructive role on the way forward. The United States stands with the Nicaraguan people in calling for free and fair presidential elections in 2021. We urge the Ortega regime to take concrete actions now to restore democracy by supporting the reforms necessary to allow the conditions for genuinely free and fair elections, including credible international electoral observation and ceasing the repression against Nicaraguans calling for democracy. Today, the Ortega regime announced what it calls electoral reform. This so-called reform ensures nothing more than that the legitimate political opposition will have no role whatsoever on the country's Supreme Electoral Commission. There is nevertheless still time to act before the OAS General Assembly's resolution's May deadline. Unfortunately, once in power, the temptations for an elected government to use the powers that modern societies everywhere vest in them can lead to governments abusing the rights and legal protections of members of the societies that choose them. Often this is simply to perpetuate their own hold on power. That trend, if unchecked, leads to authoritarian government. We have seen states in the Americas use the mechanisms of the state to attack the free press, to attack political parties or civil society organizations, and to use the state itself to suppress freedom of association. Not through any clearly identifiable legal mechanism, but through intimidation, which drains the will of free people to exercise their rights. The United States is strongly committed to supporting charter implementation and opposing all acts that undermine democracy. We, as OAS member states, have an important opportunity before us today as we begin to contemplate the successes and challenges of democratic charter implementation and to share best practices. We must now work to commit ourselves to deepening this ongoing dialogue and move forward with a concrete, timely, and effective course of action to make the Charter's promise a tangible reality for our hemisphere citizens, especially in countries that are not living up to the principles of the Charter. We owe it to our hemisphere and the charter that we all committed to uphold. It is one of the most important commitments every country in this room, this virtual room that we sit in, has made, and we should not let the opportunity to make progress on its implementation slip through our hands. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Muy bien.
Very well. I'd like to thank member countries for their remarks. The committee, with the help of the Secretariat, has taken note of everything that has been shared by the panelists as well as by member countries. Allow me to remind you all, and that goes for the delegations who have spoken today as well as our special guests, our panelists and experts who have yet to take the floor, to please send your statements so that we can include those statements and presentations in the documentation that will go into the report that will be drafted on the results of this meeting, as well as the recommendations that will be put together to bring to the 9th Summit of the Americas. That brings to a close our second panel of this special meeting, and I would like to now give the floor once again to Ambassador Frieden to continue chairing the rest of this meeting.
No lo escuchamos, presidente.
Okay. Got it. Thank you, Ambassador Fiallo, for chairing, for co-chairing this meeting and for leading this this very informative panel discussion. I am just looking at the agenda now, and seeing as the hour is late already, I am not going to make any closing remarks. I've already made what would have been my closing remarks in the statement that you just heard. So with that, if there is no further business to be conducted, I would propose that the meeting now be adjourned.
Mr. Freden?
Yes.
This is Alejandro Aristizábal, Mr. Freden. We have a final section with the participation of President Laura Chinchilla.
Oh, my goodness. Well, I think I was a little bit premature then in calling for an meeting. Chalk it up to inexperience. Great. Well, then let me to offer the floor to President Chinchilla, and along with my sincere apologies for trying to close out the meeting early. The floor is yours.
I believe that we're all driven by the same pull. On the one hand, we have great satisfaction with what we have heard today, with the presentations, with the recommendations as well. But also I believe that we all deserve a break and should be able to grab some coffee. That is why I just have a few words to share. Mainly wanted to focus on the kinds of issues that I believe have come out of these two panels that we have had this afternoon. And I would like to break these different aspects down into four categories. The first has to do with the broad recognition we have heard today around the problem that we have in our democracies, and that is that they are under threat. The pandemic has been exploited in order to reduce and curtail freedoms and to weaken the rule of law. Many of these issues have been around for a long time and have pulled back the veil on the structural issues that our democracies are facing. And also the fact that these threats have taken different shapes, which require that we make adjustments to the instruments we have as an organization. The second category has to do with the recognition of the support of the summits in building an inter-American system that has been able to develop very important and useful instruments to protect and advance human rights and democracy, as well as the recognition that the Democratic Charter continues to be the best possible instrument to take on the deterioration of democracy as we see it today in our countries. The third point has to do with the proposals that were put on the table on how to strengthen resiliency for our democracies as well as for regional instruments. This was broken down into the preventive steps and restorative steps. On the preventive side, we heard suggestions as a creation of new task forces and working groups, new rapporteurships broken down by countries or topics. We also heard about capacity building for technical capacity of our organization through strengthening the DECO, as well as the rapporteurship on the freedom of speech and others. There was also the recommendation for outreach regarding what has been achieved through the Democratic Charter. And one of these has been the strengthening of the civic culture and civic spaces in our countries, and also the inclusion of the Democratic Charter in domestic systems, as we've seen with a number of instruments. We've also seen support given to the civil society through summits processes and through other organizations and programs implemented in the region. We also heard about protecting the ability to hold elections as one of the major achievements in our region. I think in terms of restorative mechanisms, we also heard ideas like directing the CHAP to conduct a study to see what kinds of parameters can help better identify what is happening in a time of crisis, and also how to more systemically understand the experiences that have led to addressing an issue like Venezuela. Now, the fourth topic has to do with how important it has been said that diplomacy and policies can be in order to advance what the OAS has been doing. We can continue to strengthen the organization, but if there is no diplomatic and political action that is timely and goes through the different collective bodies, it will be very difficult to bring about change. I think at this point, I should say that we trust that the Summit of the Americas, which is a summit that inspires a lot of hope and expectations from our region, become an event that can really address many of the uncertainties that we currently see in our region today. I am convinced that that will be the case, and I wish you all a great road to the Summit of the Americas. And of course, thank you very much for having me at this very important meeting.
Thank you, President Chinchilla. With that, I believe the meeting is now coming to a close, unless my co-chair wishes to say anything additional. We will adjourn the meeting now. Okay. I'd like to thank everybody, thank all of the participants, member states, secretariat, the leadership the organization, Secretary General Almagro, especially my co-chair, for making this event a very useful and successful 3-hour experience. And I think it adds important value to our preparations for the 9th Summit of the Americas. So thank you very much. And with that, I will adjourn this meeting. Meeting adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador.